So before we jump into it further, just want to take a minute to let you know who I am and why I'm talking to you about this. So again, my name is Scott Kleinrock. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at the Waterwise Community Center, and I am an avid gardener. These days, I work mostly within the realm of waterwise plantings, California native plantings, and helping people move the landscape of Southern California in that direction. But vegetable gardens and fruit trees are close to my heart as well. My partner and I have a big backyard garden in the city of Pomona with raised beds, herbs in containers, lots of in-ground beds, and a small orchard of 22 fruit trees, most of them quite young. We only moved in here about 2 years ago. And we grow lots and lots of vegetables. Edible horticulture is what brought me to the landscape world in the first place. And for the last about 15 years, I have been obsessed on this journey, which originally started with being focused on urban agriculture. In the past, I developed and then ran an urban agriculture demonstration and experimentation garden at the Huntington Library and Botanical Gardens, where I was really focused on methods of sustainably growing food in the city, essentially. And one of the things that I came to realize is that the difference between growing a few vegetables and a ton of vegetables really comes down to soil, fertility, and irrigation management. I mean, there's other things as well, but those are the things that, as I've worked with gardeners in different stages of their kind of learning journey about how to grow edible plants, those are the key things: soil, fertility, and water relationships. And so today we're going to talk all about the water. But if you're really looking to kind of round out some of that other stuff, I'd encourage you throughout the year, we teach a class on soils, fertilizers, and compost, which will have another part of these techniques, and as well join us for our vegetable gardening and fruit tree classes. Proper irrigation management is one of the keys that will make the difference between growing a few vegetables and having so many vegetables that you and your partner are getting into arguments about whose turn it is to go out and harvest the tomatoes, between having just a few things for yourself or having enough to have your kitchen full of vegetables, share with the neighbors, and be delivering food to the local food bank as well, fresh from your garden. And so that's how my partner, who's a very skilled horticulturalist, and I grow as well. These are just a few bits of the harvest from our garden last year, which was our first garden in what had been very neglected soil. But really understanding how much water the plants need and how deep to water that, especially through what should be the peak of the season, it is really going to help you. So with that, here's today's outline. We're going to start with some big questions about water management and irrigation. And then to ground this thing that seems kind of complicated and maybe a little bit nebulous for a lot of gardeners, we're going to look at, in a simple, logical way, the relationships between plants, soil, and water. Once we have that grounding, we're going to use that to explore how you can know how much water plants need and when. From there, you can look at how can you take that information and then understand how to know how long to water in your specific garden. And then with all of that knowledge, we can then look at the top irrigation systems that I would recommend for growing fruit trees and vegetable gardens at home. We're going to, for fruit trees, look at both a high efficiency overhead spray system and a drip system. And for vegetable gardens, we're going to look at a different kind of drip system. We're going to talk about how to build them, where to get the materials, and how to design them, and then how to understand them so you can know for that system how long should you be watering in your garden. And so here are some of the questions that you might be asking yourself. How often should you be watering? Why would you be watering at that frequency? Or if you're not quite sure about some of those answers, how do you gauge what you're doing right now? When you water, how deeply does that, how how much water are you putting out, whether it's in gallons or inches, how deep is that water going? You should be able to know all of these things to optimally manage your irrigation. Here are some questions that I often get. How long should I water my orange tree? How long should I water my vegetable gardens? And that answer is always the same. And that answer is it depends. There are so many different site factors. One of the main ones being that all irrigation systems, depending on how they're designed and built, are going to put out water at slightly different rates. Plus, there's your local climate, there's your soils, there's a whole bunch of other things. And so today we are going to look at those factors so you can put together your personal irrigation plan. But the big answer is when we should water is when the soil is dry enough that the plants need it. So we shouldn't just be watering 2 days a week just because we're watering 2 days a week. Now, you might be watering 2 days a week. That's currently how often I'm watering my vegetables in the ground. But the real answer is you're going to match it up to when the soil is dry enough that your plants need it. How long you should water is it should water for long enough for the soil to be nice and moist through the depth of the plant's root zone. And so that's why we're going to have to understand how to know how deep our water is going to be going. And again, how much water that requires, it depends. And so there are really what I consider three main strategies to figure this all out. The first one is the old school approach, and there is some value to this approach. And it's learning the soil season after season, year after year, by watering, digging around, not just top couple of inches, but really getting in there with a trowel or a shovel, especially with fruit trees needing to dig down over a foot, feeling the soil, irrigating, digging, feeling the soil again, carefully observing your plants until you develop a good understanding of how things work on that specific site. If you move to another site, different plants, different soils, you're going to have to start over again. Over time, you can start to identify some triggers or observations in the garden that let you know when it's time to water again. So one example with that might be if you have an orchard of mixed fruit trees, your first plants to start to get a little dramatic looking, show just a little bit of sign of water stress, might be guavas if you have them. And so the guava leaves looking a very specific way might let you know that it's time to water again. Just one example. And then you're going to be poking and digging around, maybe using a soil probe deeply enough to be sure that when you do water, the water has penetrated through the root zone. Some of my first kind of mentors, really old school gardeners who had been doing this for 50, 60 years by the time I met them, this is how they managed water, and they could do it effectively. The disadvantage for most of us who might have a relatively small vegetable garden and have been doing this for just a few years is that it takes a long time and a lot of digging around and a lot of interaction with your garden to really get good at doing this. The next strategy is to use water management models. That's a lot of what we're going to be discussing in this class. This is using kind of modern research, technology, weather reporting, and a little bit of math. And I've done some of that math for you already. I've created some charts to minimize the amount of math that you would need to do. This is how most modern farms are run. And it's effective. And it's a lot of what we are going to discuss. But ultimately, I think the third strategy is the most effective, which is to integrate a little bit of both of these approaches. And so what I'm going to encourage you to do is to use this content to get started, to kind of form a really educated understanding of a baseline of where to start with your irrigation. And then as much as you can, continue to be doing that specific observation, poking around, digging around every once in a while. Shouldn't have to be doing it consistently all the time, but to kind of check in and refine things a little bit because every site is different. So that's really, for me, what has been the best approach. I start with those models. They work really well for me. And then I kind of refine just a little bit from there. Water management might not be super simple. That's why a lot of people don't really want to think of it for quite a while until they maybe realize that they're missing out and their gardens can be healthier if they take it more seriously. But it doesn't need to be complicated. So what I have tried to do in this 3-hour class is create the presentation that I wish somebody gave me when I was getting started that would have saved me years of kind of learning bits of things and picking things up here and there, and really try to get you jump started with success in being able to manage water effectively in your edible gardens. And so we're going to start by taking a look at the plant's relationship with water and go from there. I assure you, you can do this and it will make overall gardening success easier for you. It will help maximize your investment, whether it's your time gardening or your financial investment of buying plants and seeds and soil amendments. We want to make sure we get a good yield. And this absolutely will help you get a good, reliable yield. One thing that I forgot to mention at the beginning, I just noticed that it came up in the chat. I'm recording this workshop right now. So after just a little bit of light editing at downtime at the beginning, this is going to be posted on YouTube early next week. And if you go to cbwcd.org/YouTube, that's cbwcd.org/YouTube, that'll get you right to a playlist that has all of our recent online workshops there. And so every once in a while, I'm going to have kind of a mental palate cleansing slide, just a picture of one of my favorite California native plants that if you are local to where we are, kind of inland Southern California valleys, most of these plants are gorgeous and only need water once a month and are great complements in the drier areas outside our edible gardens because they'll bring beneficial insects, which help control our pest insects. So just a little bit of a breath in between some kind of heady information. In some ways, it is more fun to teach some of the other edible gardening workshops where we look at a lot of beautiful pictures of plants and things we want to eat. But this is perhaps the most important workshop that I teach about edible gardening. So what is irrigation anyways, and what's the point? Well, my perspective, here's what irrigation is primarily used for in the edible garden. In edible gardens, we are growing plants from all over the world, and we can grow plants from so many different parts of the world that are so delicious in Southern California. It's one of the reasons that some people started moving here a while ago. And so essentially what we are doing is we are hotter and drier than the natural conditions of most of the homes of where our edible plants evolved. And even some of those edible plants that are from dry areas, where they kind of naturally evolved tended to be maybe in a riparian or a wetter kind of microclimate. They're not really growing out in the blasting dry sun in the middle of the Middle East. And so what we are trying to do is we're primarily trying to supplement the natural rainfall or the natural moisture availability to make the conditions more like that plant's natural home. Another thing we're doing with our irrigation is helping get newly planted plants, whether it's seeds or transplants, established, well rooted in, because in nature, the parent plant might put out thousands of seeds and only a few need to survive. If we're purchasing seed and we're putting them in what's a relatively small vegetable garden, we want to have better results than that. We want as many of the seeds as we plant, as many of the trees we transplant to survive as possible. And then finally, it's needed to help them grow, to resist pests and diseases, and to produce a high yield of high quality. However, improperly managed irrigation will also have effects. And this can be too much irrigation as well as too little irrigation. I see too much irrigation just as often as too little irrigation. And so improperly managed irrigation will leave plants either stunted or with too much, sometimes excessively large, but without producing as much of a yield. So overwatered and over-fertilized tomatoes, for example, you might have these giant hulking vines, but without as much of a yield as you might want. Too little or too much irrigation can encourage the presence of pests and diseases. It could leave those plants more vulnerable to pests and diseases. And it can also create issues with nutrient availability in the soil, whether that's not enough water for the plants to be able to effectively gather those nutrients, or whether you're just vastly overwatering and flushing those valuable nutrients down into lower levels in the soil where the roots can't reach them. And then especially with watering too much, you're going to end up with more watery bland and less sweet tasting fruit. To me, this is like absolutely critical with tomatoes. You can get these big, beautiful tomatoes, but they might not taste like much. And this is one of the things where having homegrown tomatoes, if you really are careful with the irrigation management, can lead to stuff that's better tasting than you can buy absolutely anywhere. And so what's irrigation anyways, and what is the point? So this is a very simplified but perfectly effective for the purposes of this class little look at the plant water cycle. So precipitation, rain, or irrigation comes down and adds water to the system, puts water down into the soil. And then the water leaves through two different ways. The first one is pretty simple. It's evaporation. So the sun beats down on the surface of the soil, and that draws water just through the normal process of evaporation off the top of the soil. But as the soil dries out at the top, there's going to be and this depends some on your soil type, how strong this effect is. But essentially, there's a gradient that changes. And so water will be wicked from the wetter parts of the soil a little bit lower down, up again towards the top of the soil to continue that evaporative process, losing water from the soil system. And then the other way that moisture is lost is through transpiration from the plant. Now, a very oversimplified way that's not scientifically accurate, but is sometimes said is transpiration is like plant sweat. If it helps you to think of it that way, you can. But what it is a little bit different. And so this kind of poorly photocopied picture right here from the California Master Gardener Handbook is a little bit more useful. And so basically what happens is the roots are able to bring water in through the soil. For a plant to a non-woody plant, most of our vegetables, to remain erect, and for the leaves of woody plants to remain alive and not wilted, there needs essentially to be an almost continuous flow of moisture up the stems of the plants, traveling in what's called the xylem. It's the part of the plant that moves moisture and in that moisture nutrients through the system. And it does that and makes the stem stay kind of rigid through a continuous flow of moisture that goes up through it and then exits out through the pores in the leaves called stomata. The important thing that we need to understand as gardeners is that for the plant not to be stressed, this water needs to be continuously available. If this water isn't available in the quantity that the plants need, wilting begins, and beyond that, basically water becomes water vapor or air, and essentially that causes like an embolism inside the system, which is hard to recover from, and that's where things start permanently wilting or getting dieback from moisture stress. And so this needs to be a continuous flow, and that's the flow that pulls moisture and nutrients through the plant. So plants use some water to grow, but that's between less than 1% and 3%. The vast majority of the water that a plant uses, 97 to over 99%, is through this transpiration process. And so you're going to hear the term a lot. It's a key fundamental term, evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration is just a fancy word that means the total water being lost and eventually needs to be replaced through the combination of evaporation directly off the soil and the transpiration of the plant. So transpiration plus evaporation means evapotranspiration. If we mulch our gardens, which is putting whether it's compost or wood chips on top of the soil, that effectively stops the vast majority of that evaporation water loss. So then we're focused more on transpiration. That's just one of the many reasons why mulch is important in our gardens. And so the goal of evaporation is going to be to replace that evapotranspiration. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be kind of tracking that evapotranspiration. And I'm going to provide some charts because you can predict what that's going to be based on your location and what month of the year it is. And we're going to be replacing that when we irrigate. So I'll be stopping in just one more slide to check in with people and make sure that that makes sense. So if you have questions about that transpiration, evapotranspiration, what that means, or what we're talking about on this next slide, type them in as we're going, because these are going to be critical concepts for us as we go forward. We're going to be basing a lot of what we're talking about on these fundamental concepts. And so our general goal of irrigation is we want to water well before our plants reach a wilting point or other physiological harm. That's before our plants are damaged from lack of water. One side note, no matter how much water there is in the soil, on a day like this, where we are in inland Southern California, if you have zucchini or tomatoes or cucumbers, midday, they're going to look a little bit wilty. That's not necessarily what we're talking about. That is something called midday depression, and it just happens. That's a condition where the current demand to not have the plants wilt just surpasses what the plants can physically bring in through their system temporarily, no matter how much soil moisture there is. And so what you want to do in that case is just go and feel the soil. If you can feel that there's still moisture available, don't necessarily water a bunch more because that won't help. What you want to do is go back either late in the evening or more importantly, the next morning and confirm that they have fully recovered and are looking good again. If you have proper soil moisture, they will. And that temporary condition is just something that happens with those dramatic plants. So what we're talking about is permanent physical harm to the plants. We want to water well before that. But we also need to let the soil dry enough in between waterings to bring air down into the root zone. Both the roots of the plants, as well as most of our beneficial soil microorganisms, which are the real workhorses, both protecting our plants from pathogens, they're cycling nutrients, they're taking organic nutrients, whether it's just natural stuff, broken down microbes and old roots, or our organic fertilizers. And that soil microbiology is what's cycling and making the nutrients available to the plants. All of that and the plants themselves need air. And so for our plants to be happy, we also can't have constant water. We need to water well, the right amount, and then let it dry down the right amount, but then rewater before the plants are going to be stressed. And in addition to that, we don't want to waste water. And so the way to do this is to understand the depth of our root zone, which we're going to look at in just a moment, of our plants. And what we want to do is we want, when we irrigate, to water that root zone to what's called field capacity. So that's what you see in the middle of this picture right here. Field capacity is the term for when, for whatever type and condition of soil you have, that soil has as much water as it can hold in between the pore spaces of the soil. If you water more than that field capacity, what will happen is gravity will kick in and water will start to migrate down deeper and deeper into the soil. And that's the natural process through which rain and in areas where water collects, our groundwater gets recharged. So it's good that it works that way. But when we are watering our vegetable gardens, we're using clean water and we're paying for that water. We don't want to water well below our root zone and be recharging the groundwater basin. What we want to do is we want to bring that root zone maybe slightly deeper up to that field capacity where the soil can hold on to that water and have it available to the plants. We don't want to go beyond that and have saturation to where we're watering deeper than that. And we want to do that before we reach that wilting point where not enough water is available to the plants. If we don't water as we're getting to that wilting point and continue not to water, what can happen is you can reach something called the permanent wilting point. That's when a plant has gone without water or enough water for so long that no matter how much water you put down afterwards, it's not going to recover. And so we want to bring that root zone either to field capacity, or especially if the plants are still growing in, slightly below that root zone to encourage the roots to continue to go down. But we don't want to irrigate so much that we're losing water to gravity beyond that root zone. And so with that, let's kind of check in with the question and answer really quickly. I see the first few questions that have come in are about very specific orange trees and avocado trees. For those, if you have those specific questions, I would encourage you, hold those questions till the very end of the class, and I'm happy to take the time to answer those. But right now, I'm going to stick to answering questions that are specifically about the topic, the content that we're talking about. And then again, plenty of time to answer those specific questions at the end. So I don't see any questions that have come in about what we've been talking about. So hopefully that's clear to all of you, but please send them in if you do. And so with that understanding, we're going to look a little bit at root system depths. And that could vary a little bit depending on your soil conditions, other things like that. But this is a good general baseline for understanding our irrigation. Leafy vegetables and shallower rooted vegetables, and a lot of those are things that will mostly be growing in the cool season, especially the leafy vegetables. Assume that their depths are about 6 inches for leafy vegetables, maybe up to a foot. Perennials and larger or deeper rooted vegetables, we're looking at 1 foot to a foot and a half. Shrubs, trees, and deeper rooted perennial plants could be 1 foot to 6 feet. For thinking about irrigation for our edible gardens, though, and the zone we're going to be trying to wet when we are wetting our root zone, many people, including myself, will assume about 1 foot deep for vegetables. Now, if you have like a raised bed or a bed where you're just growing leafy greens in the winter, you might think about it more in that 6-inch range. But mixed vegetables, certainly, this time of year when we're looking at a lot of our larger vegetables, we're going to be trying to really reach that field capacity about a foot down when we irrigate. And maybe about 2 feet for shrubs, 2 to 3 feet for established trees. In that 2 foot range for trees, that's going to be where most of the roots that are gathering water and nutrients are going to be anyways. Deeper than that, you get into more and more kind of structural roots in most cases. And it's just not practical for us to try to water 6 feet down every time that we irrigate. So we're looking at, essentially, to simplify it as much as possible, about a foot down for our vegetables and maybe a couple of feet for fruit trees. Here is a big takeaway. When I talk to a lot of people who are having trouble with their edible gardens and ask them about how they're watering, what they're using to apply water, how often they're watering, for how long, many people, this might not be all of you, but many people need to water their fruit trees and vegetables deeper to slowly apply more water when they are watering, but a little bit less often. Even in this weather, in the vast majority of cases, if your vegetables are established, you don't need to be watering every day, even if you're in inland Southern California. If you're literally out in the desert, I don't really have experience growing out in the desert, your conditions might be different, but certainly in our local service area, Western San Bernardino County, out through Riverside, San Gabriel Valley, San Fernando Valley, general baseline. For warm season Southern inland California, establish vegetables 2 to 3 times a week in this kind of peak of summer. So currently for me, where I live in Pomona, we have like a sandy soil type with a good bit of gravel in it that I've slowly, and my partner has slowly dug out of our vegetable beds. Our in-ground beds, we're watering twice per week in this weather. I think maybe this week I did go ahead and do it a third time, but this is going to be the first time that I've done that this whole year. And then our raised beds, which were soil that we brought in, which is extremely sandy. We haven't been able to build as much organic matter in them yet. We are doing 3 times per week. If you have clay soil or maybe afternoon shade for your vegetable garden area, you might be able to water less. You might put down a little bit more water when you do, and we'll look at how to know those kinds of things in a little bit. I've had gardens like in the San Gabriel Valley, similar, just a little bit cooler, where my in-ground beds I'm watering once per week. So again, we'll talk about baselines and then we'll refine it from there. For those of you with a more advanced understanding of this, if you are doing everything kind of like by how you would be managing water for a farm, you can specifically look at soil type, root zone depth, do this whole other layer of math and kind of refine that frequency based on a mathematical model. But that's one level more than we're going to get into here. And realistically, I find that more applicable to if you have, like an acre of a certain crop with identical water demands. For most of us in our home gardens, we're managing maybe a couple areas with vegetables, some fruit trees, some landscape areas, and kind of redoing all of that based on that system that we're not going to look at becomes a little bit much to manage that irrigation frequency. So these baselines tend to work quite well. And so then for established fruit trees, you're looking at usually every other week or once a week irrigation. Again, irrigating the right amount, which we'll look at in a little bit when you do that. My general rule is fruit trees immediately after planting for the first at least 3 years, I'm watering them once a week. And then once things are well established, depending on the soils, I might go down to watering twice per month, but I'm going to be watering twice as much. So the amount of water that they're going to need total, which we will again be looking at in just a little bit, is going to be the same because it's that physiological process. It's just how deep and how frequent you might choose to water. But I've known commercial citrus growers out in Ojai. So again, kind of similar. They do a weather-based once a week schedule and grow very high quality citrus. With fruit trees, you kind of can't go wrong if you want to stick to that once a week. If you are in our area or similar climates and have that kind of loamy or sandier soils, heavy clay, that might after establishment bring you more to that twice a month. And then as you get to the cool season, and this will be a little bit of a judgment call, it'll be less often. If we have a cool winter with a good series of storms, you might have a couple of months where you might not need to water your established vegetables or might not need to water them much at all. So you will get to a point where this is kind of peak schedule, and then you might switch down to once per week eventually. With the vegetables, these are a baseline, but also then remember, don't set it and forget it. If we have a heat wave in coordination with Santa Ana winds, you might water a little bit more. And when things are young or getting established, you'll definitely be watering more often, maybe not quite as deep. So all these models we're going to look at, these charts I'm going to show you, that's to get us a really reliable baseline. But then if you really are wanting to be effective, you're going to adjust from there based on your observations. And so let's look at a couple of questions before we move on. So from Aura, can you correlate field capacity to watering wands and gauges? Will you retype that in and let me know what you mean by watering wands and gauges? When I hear the term watering wand, I think of like the thing that I use when I'm watering at the end of a hose. That's like 2 feet of kind of like solid material with a breaker at the end. And can't necessarily correlate that to field capacity, but really refining how much water you're putting out, how long you need to water, you absolutely can. And I could run you through that towards the end of the workshop and the question and answer, because it'll take a little bit of math. But I want to make sure I'm understanding. See, next question. If your plant starts to wilt, can you cut off the wilted part like the top or exterior leaves, and can the plant regenerate? So yes, so a couple of things. If it just starts to wilt, plants, depending on how far it's gone, have an amazing ability to recover some, and how much it can recover will depend on the plant. Basically, what they do is they close their stomata, those pores, overnight, and they allow that allows the plant to start bringing more water back in, and it actually builds up pressure to where it can remove some of that water vapor that's making it wilt because it's not actual water, and rehydrate. If in fact, you come back the next morning, part of the plant is still wilted, it has not recovered overnight, yeah, you can. It depends. If it's gone too far, the plant might not recover, but certainly the areas that are still wilty, if some of the plant's looking good, some are still wilty, cut them off, and then the plant will kind of scar over that, and there's a chance that it can recover, definitely. And then the question was, what about small containers for the frequency gardening, 1 to 5 gallon containers? That's going to be the good thing about 1 to 5 gallon containers, is that it's pretty easy to feel the container. So when your 1 to 5 gallon containers are wet and have been recently watered, you can kind of pick up on them a little bit. Don't need to pick them all the way up and feel that weight. You can use that weight as a quick gauge to know, without digging down to the bottom of it, how dry things have gotten. I will tell you that anything, if you are in inland Southern California, anything less than a 5 gallon container, if it's not in part shade in the summer, is going to be just pretty much impossible to keep watered. I wouldn't recommend that you really try to grow anything in less than a 5 gallon container. 5 gallon container being an absolute minimum. And even then, like occasionally I'll grow some peppers if I don't have enough room in the ground in some 5 gallon containers, part shade or afternoon shade. And this time of year, you very likely will have to be watering it every day. So the larger container, the more water you can hold, the better kind of capacity that you will have. But it does get tricky watering in small containers. Does the frequency also apply to fruit trees in containers? Again, containers are going to have to be more often, and it depends a lot on your container, a lot on your soil mix, and a lot on your sun exposure, because there's just less of that buffering capacity to hold it. So containers this time of year could need to be every day, might be every other day. They're going to take a lot more frequent watering. Absolutely. Oh, okay. So the question from the soil probe, a probe that you put near the roots of the plant with a gauge at the end that shows a wet to dry scale. So I don't love those kinds of probes for really doing water management, especially the little cheap ones. There's some that are kind of higher end. They might cost like $70, $80, $100 that are a little bit more reliable. But the key with those probes is the way that they work requires you to kind of understand and calibrate them. So that doesn't necessarily mean you need to change a dial, but they'll have a wet to dry scale. But what does that actually mean? So to get any real use out of them, what you are going to have to be doing is you're going to have to be watering, digging, feeling your soil, associating that with when you need to rewater your plants, and get to know it well enough. And then as you are doing that, stick that probe into the ground and see what it says, and really get to know your instrument. At that point, I actually prefer a soil probe that's just the kind where it's a hollow tube, and you stick it into the ground and you pull it up, and it brings out a little core of soil that's about a foot deep, and you can pull it out of that probe. And it's sometimes called a soil sampling probe. You can buy them online, because at that point, if I'm going to need to do that much, I'd rather just pull up a little kind of tube sampling of that soil and feel it myself, and not necessarily trust a gauge. So you can try it. I'm not going to say it absolutely doesn't work, but I haven't found those useful kind of in a long-term situation. What I do is I rely on these techniques we're talking about today. And because I am kind of a nut about this stuff, and I'm willing to invest in all the tools to help me, I have one of those soil sampling probes. Good ones will still cost about $80. And if I'm kind of refining my schedule or want to check, I'll just pull out that little core of soil and crumble it in my hand and feel it. If there are some not the kind that you put in and pull back out, there are some kind of permanent installation kind of probes that are accurate, but they normally have somewhat expensive readers. Some of them work with irrigation timers now, but because most of our vegetable gardens are so diverse, I feel like those sorts of things are mostly useful if you have like 10 acres of oranges and very similar conditions all throughout your system, and not as useful for a highly diverse vegetable gardens. Okay, just a couple more questions and then we'll jump back into it, but these are some good questions. When should we water? I'm glad you asked that, because that's not something that is in this particular presentation, in the morning or at nighttime. Depends on what kind of system you have. If you are watering anything that's going to have any overhead watering, and the leaves might get wet, especially with your fruit tree zones, then you're going to want to water early in the morning. Ideally, that's where a automatic timer will help you. You can program it to kind of early in the morning, just before sunrise. Then as the sun is coming up, the plants won't stay, the leaves won't stay wet and encourage potential fungal disease issues all overnight. They'll be gently dried off in the early morning sun. But if you do it in the middle of the day or when it's hot, that can actually burn the leaves. The water drops can act like little magnifying glasses if leaves are wet during the real heat of the day in summer, and it can encourage those disease issues. Now, if you're watering with a drip irrigation system, you have quite a bit more flexibility, and ideally, you still might water early morning. Generally, what I will do kind of before the heat of the day, get those plants ready. So what I generally will do is that early morning hours, kind of before I wake up, get out of bed, the overhead irrigation systems that I have in my fruit tree zones run. And then later in the morning, I'm kind of like already up and getting ready for work. Maybe I will have my vegetable zones run. So before the heat of the day, but the sun's already up. And I like to do those so I can also just kind of do a quick walkthrough and make sure that everything is looking good and that there's no issues, especially this time of year. Just say, for example, there's an issue with the irrigation timer and it didn't run. After a couple of days, your plants could be, not doing very well. So it just keeps me in touch with my garden. I like to do a quick walk around in the morning anyways. And then last question, what is your opinion about grow bags and containers? If you are in hot Southern California, certainly I would prefer a large grow bag to a smaller plastic container, but grow bags tend to be very porous on the outside. If you're in a really wet climate, that can be good because it really helps drainage. But if you are in hot Southern California, you don't necessarily want your soil to be draining out or have all that airflow all around it quite as often. I do know some people that have been successful with them. Again, certainly the price can be right for a large container, but you will need to water a little bit more. I tend to, if I'm gonna I grow some of my herbs that I want to have right outside my kitchen door where it's all concrete, in large containers. I tend to just from the big box hardware store, they'll sometimes have 22-inch plastic containers that are relatively inexpensive. I actually prefer those because in our summer heat, that plastic actually helps the soil hold on to the water a little bit more than like a porous grow bag. Okay, so let's jump back into it. Factors that impact plant water needs. So how much water is your plant going to need? Weather is a huge one. Obviously, if it's hotter, your plants are going to need more water more frequently than if it's cooler. In addition to just the air temperature, the sun exposure, how many hours of direct sunlight they're getting. And then finally, genetics, which basically means what kind of a plant it is. Obviously, if you have a cactus, it can be in the same conditions. Your tomato plant is going to need quite a bit more water, even if those plants are the same size, just based on their genetics and their adaptations. So those are going to be the main things that affect how much water your plant actually needs. Now, the other thing that we need to be thinking about is that water, when it's provided, needs to be available to them. So that's going to be based on the soil's ability to hold water that's applied. And that's going to be based on soil texture, meaning do you have sandy, loamy, silty, or clay soil? And we'll look at a slide that will explain that a little bit in just a minute. Soil structure and organic matter. So that means, for example, even if you have sandy loam soil, if you have sandy loam soil that's had a truck parked on it for 3 years, versus if you have sandy loam soil that's just been left alone and neglected for 3 years, versus if you have sandy loam soil that's had compost added with no-dig gardening, and there's been active soil microbiology building little aggregates in the soil, you have organic matter in it. Those three soils are going to have the same soil texture, the same amount of sand, silt, clay, but they will perform very differently. The compacted one will hold the least amount of water. There's literally not the pore space in between the soil aggregates to hold a lot of air or water, and it won't infiltrate it very quickly as well. Really good agricultural soil is only about 60%, maybe 50 to 60% stuff, and 50 to 60% open space that can hold air or water. And so our beautiful garden soil on the other side of that spectrum is going to be much closer to that. And then, and the last one is soil cover. And that's sort of soil cover doesn't truly affect the soil's ability to hold water. But if we look at it as a system, having that soil covered in a mulch layer of either wood chip mulch or compost, for example, will cut off that evaporation. So essentially that facilitates the soil's ability to hold on to water longer, even though it's not actually a product of the nature of the soil itself. It's the nature of what's covering it. So those are all important factors as well. And so now we're going to start relating these concepts and add another concept, which is the weather. And then we'll bring that together and look at what that means for how much water numerically our plants are going to need. And that'll be the first step to us setting up proper watering schedules. And so the important concept for this is reference evapotranspiration. So you will remember, evapotranspiration is how much water you're going to need to replace to the soil based on what the plants have transpired and what's evaporated. And so in terms of us making that concept practical to us, we rely on this thing called reference evapotranspiration. And that's just a fancy word for saying the amount of water in inches, as like we had a rain event, a 1-inch rain event, 2-inch rain event. An inch of water is over whatever amount of area. That's like that area literally being covered in an inch of water and then letting that water percolate into the soil. It's like an inch of water in the bottom of a bathtub or in a pan or something like that. And so the way this is figured out and projected is the reference evapotranspiration is for a certain condition in a certain area in full blasting sun in the weather conditions, how much water is that crop that's going to need the most amount of water of any plant going to need replaced in inches. And so that's the reference crop is if we're talking agriculture, you'll normally see it referred to as alfalfa. If we're talking landscape, you might see it referred to as fescue grass. And those are basically just the plants that take the most amount of water, and what they take is the same as each other. So that's why you might see either one referenced. And so basically what reference evapotranspiration is, for example, if we look at just January, in a particular area, and so you can see 3 areas here, Palm Springs, Riverside, and San Francisco. So in a particular area, in an open field, in full sun, how much water will that fescue or that alfalfa need replaced in each of these months, total cumulative over the months? How much water is lost to that system through evaporation and transpiration? And so in a minute, we'll explain why we choose those highest crops. But for now, the concept is ETO, or reference evapotranspiration, refers to that for those highest crops. And it's pretty intuitive to see what happens. In the hottest month of the year, the most is used, and in the cooler months of the year, the least is used. And where you are, based on your weather, is going to impact that. So here we see San Francisco, the least, Riverside, and Palm Springs out in the desert, way up at the top. Pretty intuitive. And what we see here are the number of inches as if it is like rain that would need to replace it on the left. Why it's relevant for us, even though we're not really talking about alfalfa or fescue grass right now, is because when we know this highest number, so this top of the yellow section right here, all of the plants that we are going to be growing are going to be a lower percentage of that higher number. That's what their water demand is going to be. So, for example, vegetables actually overall are going to be in our gardens generally matched to that highest number. So if that alfalfa, that reference evapotranspiration for the month of July is 8 inches over the month, that's how much water we're going to need to replace for our vegetable crops. Citrus trees, for example, are around 60%. And so if again, for the month of July, if in this area we're at 8 inches, 60% of that, that's how much over the whole month we're going to need to replace for our citrus trees. And so I've created some charts for you that we're going to look at the different crops we're likely to be figuring this out for. And I've done a lot of that math for you for this area. If you're in a different area, you can look up what the monthly reference evapotranspiration is for your area and then create a chart like that for yourself. If you are not in our local area and in California, I will share a resource with you where you can figure that out. But oftentimes you can just in a search engine type your area, either your city or your part of the state, and reference evapotranspiration, and some sort of like agricultural college in your area, or maybe a government agency will have posted that on an average year for each of these, for every month out of the year. And so this is the same for most landscape plants. Native Mediterranean and desert plants are actually a little bit different because they have some physiological adaptations to summer drought. Their part of their physiology like actually shuts down and goes semi-dormant. So their curve is a little bit different. So if you're interested in that, join some of our other classes where we're talking about maintenance and care of those water-wise plants, and we can get into that. So with that basic concept, now we're going to jump into what this means for plant water demand. So there's some new concepts that have probably been introduced to you, but we will get through this together. If you are following all of this, that's great. If you're not, ask questions. But even if you don't have every little aspect of it, we are going to start to make this very practical. And so hopefully you can just pick up on the practical part of it. Let's see. So just checking the questions really quickly. Okay, another little mental break, deep breath. Here's the chart. So this is a chart that I prepared using multiple years of weather data focused on inland Southern California gardens. So I did pull this together specifically for the Waterwise Community Center service area, that Western San Bernardino County. But then I also went and I looked at the differences. If we go into like San Gabriel Valley, San Fernando Valley, it's very similar. So I feel confident that this chart can work well for all of those conditions. And then know that, for example, if you're kind of a little bit more coastal, Orange County or like Los Angeles proper, you'll be a little bit less. And then if you're on the coast, quite a bit less. So I would encourage you, and in a moment, we'll look at some of those resources to find this for your area and make your own little chart to guide your garden. But here's what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to lay out each month of the year. And then based on those weather records or those evapotranspiration records, you're going to create your reference evapotranspiration for each of those months of the year. And so in our area, for example, July is everywhere in California going to be the maximum. So that's just under 8 inches. January is going to be our least, that's 2.4, and it's going to go through there. So the amount of through the whole month water that your vegetables are going to need to be replaced is going to be the same as that reference evapotranspiration. And then these are just some general numbers that are used. Citrus in a home landscape, it's going to be about 0.6, 60%. From the agricultural information, I've known citrus grove managers that do it at that. Sometimes they do it higher, but that tends to work pretty well. And then if it seems like you need a little bit more, you can go a little bit higher. If you have an irrigation zone where you are just watering deciduous fruit trees, apples, nectarines, peaches, plums, things that lose all their leaves, that's a little bit different because the amount of transpiration that a plant goes through is directly proportional to the amount of total leaf surface area it has. And so when it loses its leaves and then slowly grows them back and then has the most peak season, what you'll find is that some months of the year that would be considered about 50%. Some months of the year it's much higher at the peak. And so this is something that would respond to those needs. And again, if you're like really managing an orchard, you can find slightly more detailed data, but there's only so much that I can kind of cram into this presentation. And this gets people so close that this works really, really well for most home gardeners. However, what most people will do with their fruit trees, this is what I do at home, is that most people, if they're growing, even I have 22 fruit trees at home, but I don't have it set up to where I have enough of like citrus all in one place, and then deciduous trees all in one place, and then avocados all somewhere else. Then I'm irrigating them all separate. I have two zones of my automatic irrigation system that water my fruit trees, and it's kind of a mix. And what I've found is that so subtropical trees like avocados, 70% works really well. 70% of that evapotranspiration, highest number. Some commercial avocado growers they did a whole bunch of study. They found that 80% gets you a little bit more production, but for a long time it was 70%. And I generally, in a mixed zone, I will do 70% for everything. It's slightly higher than citrus needs. Peak season, it might be slightly lower than optimal for the deciduous trees. But what I find is that if I'm doing everything else correctly, especially if I'm mulching, cutting off that evaporation, everything's very happy with that. And then additionally, for us home growers of deciduous trees, especially for like nectarines and plums and apricots, commercial growers are trying to maximize their yields and their weight that they're selling it as. But for us, it works well to actually slightly, without stressing the plant, hold back the water a little bit peak summer as things are ripening to concentrate those sugars. So what I find is that I generally have really good results on mixed zones of edible fruit trees by sticking with that 70%. And so in my yard, my vegetables are getting watered, replacing their evapotranspiration at that 100%. My fruit trees are scheduled at that 70%. Something that's going to be really critical for all of us, no matter what we're going to do from here, is understanding that peak July number of inches. And then we'll break down, next steps are going to be, so how do we get that number of inches eventually to how long do I actually run my irrigation system? So that's coming. But it all starts with knowing how many inches of water you're going to replace for that month. If you are doing this with a irrigation timer, which will save you lots of time and effort, these numbers are going to be relevant for you. Once you program into your irrigation timer that 100% maximum number, you'll have a couple of options based on your timer's settings, but one of which would be a monthly adjust, which means you don't need to go into your irrigation timer and every month of the year, it's the beginning of the next month, you need to reset everything. You can, in most timers, minimally program it to know if you set something that's 100%, that maximum for July, you can go in and then program all of the other months to automatically adjust down by the correct amount by giving it what percent of the maximum you want to water. So here's that math for you. And yeah, I would really encourage you for whichever of these categories you're going to use, if you are somewhere else, to create your own version for that. So landscape plants, depending on the plant, might work that way. Again, if it's a low water or drought adapted plant, it'll work a little bit different. For those of you who are also now starting to think about this, the gears are turning and you're thinking, what does this mean for how you should irrigate your landscape? A lot of these principles apply, but if you are in our inland Southern California areas, we've already done a lot of that work for you for most common landscape plants, whether they're low or medium water use. So if you go to inlandvalleygardenplanner.org, you can search individual plant profiles and get these set up schedules with the range of water, then again, based on your site conditions, that those plants are going to want already scheduled or figured out for you for each plant for the different months of the year. Also given to you in inches. And so this next step that we're going to talk about how do you take that inches into how much you need to water, is going to be the same for landscape plants as well. And so we will proceed. Just to give you a general idea, here's the total historical average reference evapotranspiration for some other local cities. So Santa Monica at 44, Los Angeles proper at 50, Pasadena slightly more at 52, Riverside slightly more at 56. And so you see there's a 20%-ish maybe difference in between these two, Riverside to Santa Monica. So that can be significant difference in water. And then Lancaster getting into that true desert up at 71. So again, I would encourage you if you're somewhere else to create your own chart, but minimally you can kind of look at that difference and gauge from there. So one quick extra point before we move on. Oh, I accidentally was going forward instead of going backwards. When I prepared this specific chart, if you look up a chart for our local area, you might find slightly different, might be slightly lower numbers. And if I was preparing a chart for like low water landscapes, I would use slightly different numbers. So when I was preparing this chart specifically, I was thinking in terms of our edible gardens, fruit trees, and vegetable gardens. And we never want our vegetable gardens to kind of fall behind. So what I did is I looked at over the last 5 years, what the kind of record, kind of the record hot month overall would be. And I use that for the monthly entry, because I don't want to provide you with general numbers and then have a hot June or a hot July and have you falling behind, because our soil is kind of like a bank account for water. If we start falling behind and then we're replacing, but we're replacing a little bit too little each time we water, a little bit too little, that bank account slowly gets drawn down and we can start getting into issues. And so by doing this, for example, we have had a pretty hot July. I recently looked at for this year's July where we were at, and we were just about at this number. So that's why I chose to go with the hotter months. It's kind of a little extra insurance policy for our vegetable gardens. For most of us, if we're watering this amount, we're still probably watering less than the average person who's not taking all of this into account might be overwatering their vegetable gardens. So that's how I put together this specific amount. Now, if you do happen to start to suspect that you have been underwatering a little bit and you have kind of drawn down that soil bank account some, what you're going to want to do is you're going to water extra to make sure that with that one really deep soak, well over and above what you would be doing, you're kind of recharging that bank account and then go back to watering kind of along your model. So hopefully that makes sense. Every year, month, and week is different, but that gets us into the ballpark, which is really, really useful. And then from there, you can kind of adjust. And so this helps us water optimally for both plant health and water efficiency. So here's just one example. So in our service area at the WaterWise Community Center, we do a landscape irrigation audit program where we will go out to people's properties at no cost and take a look at their irrigation system, their settings. We'll work with them and we'll pull the record from their water provider of their water use in context of their landscape area, and we'll issue them a report with all sorts of information and recommendations. But when we do that, we create a water budget for them based on their landscape type, which is here in the red, and then we track that against their actual water use. And we often find that people water way, way too much. So that's where this comes into water conservation as well. And something like this, September is extremely excessive, but something like this is often what we'll see where they're watering maybe about, right, well, still watering high in February, but kind of following the curve. And then all of a sudden it gets hot. And then all of a sudden people are watering way, way too much. And then what starts to happen sometimes is in the fall, watering demand actually starts to go down quite a bit. And so that's why those monthly numbers are really useful, because psychologically for us as people who might be out in our gardens midday in the fall, our peak temperatures might still be quite hot. But the reality is that the sun is out for significantly fewer hours of the day at those peak temperatures. So our water demand starts dropping off. But just kind of that psychological feel, we don't always realize that. So we might continue to water excessively in that time. Just one example, but this really does make a difference, both for our plant health, the quality of our yields, and for water savings and eventually financial aspects if we're overwatering as well. So with that, pretty picture, quick break, and then we'll get into talking about how we actually water plants. So let's look at, had a question come in about what kind of irrigation controller we're using. We'll talk a little bit about irrigation controllers later on in the workshop. And then, so there was just a question about the chart. Is the listed number of water replacement inches during each month equate for each watering season? So water-wise, I don't quite understand that question. The number of water replacement inches is the number of inches on average that you would need to replace for that month for that area. I don't quite understand the part about watering. Oh, sorry, equate for each watering session. Now I understand. So no, that is, so we are going to get into that. So that's going to be the total amount of water you need to replace over the entire month. And so pretty soon we are going to get into what that means in terms of breaking it down for each irrigation event or each watering session. And thank you. So the question came in from Eunice. Hello, Eunice. Thank you for joining us. Will these charts be available to print for future reference? Yeah, so before the end of the day today, I'm going to put the PDF up there. You can see in the chat, it's going to be at cbwcd.org/presentations. But I am also going to make myself a note, in addition to the full presentation with the 200 something slides, I will create a second little PDF that will just say like presentation charts, and that will just have like the relevant charts and maybe some of the examples of the calculations that we'll use. Just kind of the stuff that if you don't want all the slides, it'll be the quick reference. So I am writing down a note right now. Thank you for asking about that. And then again, for those of us who joined us later, this full presentation will be posted to YouTube after some light editing, sometime probably before midweek next week. And Danny will type both the websites into the chat again for the PDF downloads and for the YouTube. Okay, so now the next question that we come to is, so how do we actually water our plants? Take a moment to think about that based on what we've learned. I'm going to take a sip of water. It's kind of a trick question. We can't actually water plants, just like we can't actually grow plants. We can put water on the soil intelligently and provide that soil available water to the plants. All we can do is create the right conditions and let things do their stuff. And so here is a little bit of information that can inform that a little bit, looking at what happens with different soil types with the same amount of water. And this is somewhat intuitive, but also a lot of people haven't thought about it really in kind of this perspective. When you put water into sand, it goes down quickly. If you put water onto hard or heavy clay soil, it kind of pools at the top for a little while and it infiltrates slowly. And so when that dynamic is transferred to what actually happens in the soil, a couple of different relevant things happen. So this is the bottom graphic here shows with the same amount of water applied, what is going to happen in the soil. If water is applied onto sand in a spot, same amount of water, it's going to go significantly deeper and significantly less wide at the surface than it will happen with clay. For a few reasons. One, sand lets water pass down more readily, but two, on an actual microscopic physical level, sand has less of an ability to hold on to water, where clay can literally absorb and hold more water around it. It's one of those things that also causes problems for construction because clay soils can hold so much water that they can physically expand more once they are wet. And so that's that same dynamic, but here it's relevant to our watering. And so it will take more water to apply to a clay soil to reach getting down through a certain depth. So if we're, for example, we're saying we are going to try to water down to that 1 foot root zone of our vegetable plants, starting at the same amount of dryness, it will take significantly more water to apply to clay to get down to that 1 foot depth than it will to sand. However, that 1 foot after that has happened will hold more water that will be available to the plants over time in the clay than it will in the sand. And so that's why we will have to water again slightly more often in our sandy soils, because they will hold literally less water in that 1 foot of soil depth than our clay soils. And so again, there are calculations that if you are managing, 5 acres of citrus or an acre of broccoli, that you can use to really refine that. But what I find is for most backyard gardeners, it's better to start with that general 2 to 3 times a week for sandy soil, 1 to 2 times a week with a deep watering for clay. The actual amount of water that we will need to replace after a certain amount of time is going to be the same, because remember that water is being drawn out of the soil through evapotranspiration. And evapotranspiration is going to be the same no matter your soil type. But then when we do give it that deep watering, we might put down slightly more water and slightly less often for clay, and slightly less water and slightly more often for sand. So I hope that's a helpful consideration. I would encourage you to just kind of start with that basic 2 to 3 times a week for sand in the middle of the summer, 1 to 2 times a week with clay, but use that kind of conceptual understanding to refine it from there as you make your observations. Your observations are going to be based on looking at your plants and then digging down as you're refining that with a trowel, feeling soil with your hands. And so to help people figure this out, today, everybody is getting a free digital moisture probe for attending this workshop. Hold out your hand, close all of your fingers except your index finger, and take a look at it. This is your digital moisture probe. There is no replacement for feeling the soil every once in a while to help figure this out. And where are we going to feel the soil? Well, we are going to dig down some around the root zone, not right at the base of our plants when they're growing, because we don't want to dig up all the roots, but still within our irrigated area, maybe slightly outside of what we're guessing the root zone is of our vegetables. If you have that soil probe, that's great. If not, just carefully using a trowel. And then for our fruit trees, we are going to dig towards the outside of the root zone, because that's where our trees are really gathering their soil moisture and their nutrients. It's really important to understand how a tree's roots grow. The top part is, for some reason, what most people think, that like the roots or the branches of the tree are just reflected underground. But in fact, where trees really want to gather their nutrients is close to the drip line, close to the outer edge of the canopy, and up to about a third farther out than that. So if you're looking at like the radius of the tree, plus another third again. So somewhere around here, a little bit inside to outside. So obviously, if you're transplanting a bare root or a 5-gallon tree, that's where the roots are going to be at the beginning. But as you want to water there and slightly farther out. And then once your tree is mature, the real zone where you're going to focus the water is towards the edge of the canopy to a bit farther out. And use that understanding of where plants most actively want to gather water to inform your approaches to irrigation. And when we start talking about different types of irrigation, I like to think of it as like art, partially because I'm a big nerd and I think way too much about gardening, but also I think about it like art because it's not as much about the irrigation system you decide to use, whether that's a high efficiency spray system or an inline drip system. There are some terrible approaches and we'll talk about them. But at a certain point, as long as you have a decent irrigation system, it's less about whether you decide, especially for fruit trees, for a spray system or a drip system, and it's much more about using it well. So that's why I think about it like art. It's less about, a really great paintbrush doesn't make a great artist. A great artist can paint greatly with a whole variety of paintbrushes, including some that aren't necessarily ideal. So another quick mental break. Question came in from someone who joined us who missed the first hour. Yes, this video will be available, and in the chat, Danny will type in one more time where the video will be available. Okay, so we are bringing it around back to this chart with especially our reference evapotranspiration, or water needs for our vegetable gardens, and then our 70% mixed fruit tree zone. Those are going to be the examples that we're going to use. So how do we take this? Here's the number of inches that we are going to need over the whole month to replace, and turn that into an actual irrigation system runtime. Well, that is going to depend on a couple of things. It's going to depend on how often we decide to water, and we've talked about that some already, but it also is going to depend on your specific irrigation system, what type it is, how it is set up, down to the specific choices in the products that you've purchased and how you put them together. And so we'll run through some of that. And the key concept for that is going to be what your irrigation system's precipitation rate is. Precipitation rate means how quickly your irrigation system puts down water, and that is normally going to be in inches per hour. And so you might start to be able to see how this is going to work. Every time we irrigate, you're going to need to put down a certain number of inches. So to make things simple, let's just say July is 8. And we'll do detailed examples of this, but just to show you where this is going. If over the month of July, we're going to need to put down 8 inches of water, and we are going to be watering once per week. So over July, roughly, we're going to be watering 4 times. So we're going to take our total number, 8 inches of water, dividing it by, we're going to be watering 4 times. We're going to be putting down 2 inches of water each time that we water. So that would be something maybe for a fruit tree zone. So we're going to be putting down 2 inches of water each time we water. But now we need to know what our irrigation system's precipitation rate is. So if we have an irrigation system whose precipitation rate is, say, 1 inch of water per hour, that's the sort of way that a precipitation rate will be calculated, and you need to put down 2 inches of water each time you water, you're going to be programming your irrigation system to run for 2 hours. So it gets from kind of very nebulous to now we're getting very practical. So a precipitation rate is how fast your irrigation system puts down water over a given area, usually in inches per hour. So how are you going to know what your system's precipitation rate is? Well, you have a few different options. If you are using sprinklers or an inline drip system that is installed by the book, and when we do our system design and layout examples later, we'll show you exactly what that means, then those sprinklers with a specific nozzle or that drip irrigation system is going to provide information from the manufacturers, and you can get that precipitation rate either from the manufacturer websites, or if you're going to emulate one of the specific systems we're going to look at today, that will be embedded in this presentation. So you can just, if you do it the way that you're supposed to, kind of by the book, you can get that information. It's always good to check it later. And if you have overhead spray, it's pretty easy to check it. So if you have an overhead spray system, the other thing you can easily do is test this, doing it's called a catch can test in kind of professional irrigation industry. There's very specific things that we use, but you can use anything that's essentially a cylinder. So I like to use a 12-pack of wide mouth mason jars. You can also use cat food cans or tuna cans, and it's always a good idea to check after the installation. So here's a couple of examples of figuring out that precipitation rate. So for example, for my fruit tree overhead irrigation system that I'll profile for you later, and we'll show you how to do the design of. I like to use high efficiency spray nozzles. These are landscape kind of industry high efficiency spray nozzles, but they work really good for a small orchard as well. And for example, one of my zones of fruit trees uses MP1000 nozzles. And so from the irrigation manufacturer, you can get the specification. And whether it's, here's all the specifications, and some of these are useful, but I have my fruit trees planted 13 feet apart, and I have my MP1000 nozzles set up in a by the book square pattern, and we'll look at what that means. And so, and then I can adjust them down so that the radius is 13 feet. So my sprinklers are in a square pattern 13 feet apart. And if I do that at the right pressure, I'm putting down basically 0.41 inches per hour installed by the book. So that's my precipitation rate. If I need to put down 2 inches, 2 divided by 0.41, that gives me the number of hours that I need to water for each time I water. Multiply that by 60. That's the number of minutes I can put into my irrigation controller for that time of year. Same way, if you are doing this with a drip irrigation system, you can also get a chart. And when we do the example for the drip irrigation system, we'll talk about if you have different soil types, you're going to choose different spacings for your emitters and a different flow rate because you have all these options if you're getting a good quality drip product. I have other charts which will tell you for your soil type how to do that. So don't worry about that for now. But basically, again, installing drip by the book, you'll be able to look at something like on this left side, I'm going to buy a roll of drip tube with the emitters already embedded inside every 1 foot. For like my area with sandy soil, I'm going to be using a 0.9 gallon per hour emitter flow. And most often I'll do that with each line. So the distance in each line is 18 inches. So then I can follow this chart, 12-inch emitter spacing, down in the 0.9 section, 18 inches. If I install this by the book, that's going to give me a precipitation rate of 0.96 or pretty much 1 gallon per hour. Need to put down, I mean, not gallon per hour, sorry, 1 inch per hour. So I know I need to put down 2 inches. I'll be watering for approximately 2 hours. That's how it all comes together. So if you're going to be doing that catch can test, here's what I like to use. You can get them a lot of different places. Target locally is the most reliable place that I've found that stocks these. 12-pack regular mouth, sometimes called wide mouth mason jar. So the reason why you need to get this one is because there's a slight slant to it, but it's essentially a cylinder. It's not really going to change your data or your conclusions if you do a catch can test with this. If you do the ones that are narrower at the top and then get wider, that's a smaller mouth than the width inside. That won't give you accurate results. And these you can get in a 12-pack for like 11 bucks. You can open these up, place them around your drip irrigation system, run the system for a while. And then what you do is you'll collect your jars and then you'll measure it and you'll see. So this, let's just say this ran for an hour and you can see there's some variation. This one, this wasn't a very good irrigation system. This one, some improvements should be made because that one had like half as much as that one. If you have a well-installed system, there will be some variation, but it'll be grouped a little closer together. And so what you are going to do, and I have an online resource to help you with this that I'll share in just a moment, is you'll collect your jars. And then when you measure with a ruler, you'll get it in eighths of an inch. And then you really want to convert that to decimals. So here's a little chart on this page. If it's 1 1/8 inch, that's going to be 1.125 to convert that. If you do that, I created a little custom online calculator at this link right here, inlandvalleygardenplanner.org/howlongtowater. And there's other information here kind of walking you through this process, but you can put in to this calculator the number of jars you used, the length of time you ran to get these measurements. And then for each of those jars, you put in the decimals, the depth of water that you measured out. And that will give you the precipitation rate in inches because it's going to calculate your runtime as well. So not hours, it's in inches. Then you'll multiply by 60 if you want to get back to hours. You put in the desired inches of application. per run. So that would be like that 2 inches we're talking about. And it will spit out the number of inches averaging across that whole zone. Now, if you have like a lawn or something like that, there's some other little calculations you need to do because lawn needs very, very even watering because it's a bunch of tiny, tiny, tiny little plants in a lawn, and it will brown out if it's uneven at all. Our larger plants, our fruit tree zones on spray especially, they can tolerate a little bit deeper in one area, a little bit less deep in another area because the roots are going to find that water. So this slightly simpler calculation to the way that you would figure it out for like a lawn doing professional irrigation management, this works very well for fruit trees, native plants, water-wise gardens, all that sort of stuff. So, a couple of questions before we move on. How can these charts help me to know how much water when I'm using a flower pot or hose to water my vegetables? So, Debbie, hose I would be happy to talk about, but it's a slightly different series of calculations. I can bring up a slide from another class. We just don't have the time in this main presentation to get to it. But if you have a few minutes after 12 and you want to hang on till the end, and please retype that hose question in at the end, I'm happy to hang out and get into figuring it out with a hose for how to do that. It's an extra little calculation, because then you need to then bring in a measurement for, basically you'll fill your hose with your hose a 5-gallon bucket. You will calculate out gallons, and then we'll convert gallons to inches. So we can definitely do that, but we'll need to do that after the main presentation because it'll take a few minutes to explain. Okay, so pulling it around again, just to make sure we're all on the same page, I think I just built out an example, kind of like we already spoke through. So we have our inches for the month. How many times a month will you be watering? So again, we have our just general rules, veggies, 2 or 3 times a week in summer. If you have clay soil, maybe a little bit less. If you have afternoon shade and really well-developed soil with a lot of organic matter, maybe less. Fruit trees, once a week to once every other week, depending on your soil and how established they are. If it's a young fruit tree, go with a deep watering once a week. It's going to work in anywhere around here pretty well. If you are watering deep, you're watering that amount. You're going to divide that area of your garden, the total monthly irrigation demand, by the number of times over the whole month you'll plan to water. So remember, twice a week, it's going to be 8 times for the whole month. That will give you the number of inches to water each time. Then you're going to divide that number of inches to water each time by the irrigation system's precipitation rate to get your runtime. If you do it exactly this way, that will give it to you in hours. So you might have something like 1.2 hours. And then you will multiply that by 60 for your minutes. And so this is just a real world example. And this is so important. This is how it all comes together that I'm going to go through this as one more real irrigation example. Has a little bit more real world math than those round numbers that I used. So this is the exact thing that I did for a long established fruit tree zone in the place that I rented before the garden where I'm living now. I redid the irrigation system, kind of by the book, tested it out. So for July, for my fruit trees, mixed fruit tree zone, that's that 0.7 plant factor. So I'm going to have that close to 8 inches of irrigation demand total times 0.7. And that's already done for you in that column. But that gets me 5.5 inches of demand for that mixed fruit tree zone for July. So again, it's not going to be that full demand that the vegetables have. I know from the general guidelines and my experience with these well-watered or well-established plants that for this yard, I'm going to be watering twice a month. So each time I water, I'm going to be watering 2.75 inches. If for younger trees on that very fast draining soil or something like that, that would be 4 times a month. So that would be 1.38 inches. My irrigation zone is a good head-to-head installation installed by the book of those Henter MP1000 rotator nozzles, like I showed you that chart. So that's going to deliver about 0.4 inches per hour. And so this is where it is so important. If we actually do the math on that, because I'm only watering twice a month and I'm watering deeply, 2.75 inches, my irrigation system, this is a high efficiency spray system. This isn't like a typical lawn system. And part of why it's so efficient is because it waters very slowly and lets the soil slowly absorb all that water. So 2.75 inches divided by zero point 0.4, that means I am watering 6.86 hours each time I water. So this is going to be very different than those like general drought regulations you might get from your water provider, water twice a week for 5 minutes. That's based on a very different system. That's a lawn with a very short root zone. That's a sprinkler system that puts out water much faster. And so our twice a month for our fruit trees, you really need to do these calculations because most people wouldn't guess that only twice a month and for that long is what you need. But it's only 2 irrigation events in all of July. And so that 6.68 hours is going to be our maximum runtime. And then if I'm calculating those numbers for the other months and not using a kind of weather-based irrigation controller that will automatically make adjustments based on the recent weather, then you can use that percentage of max in the column to calculate for other months. Then the first time you do it, you want to check it and keep an eye on it. So you might not do it overnight. You might do it during the day, but not on a super hot day if the leaves are going to get hit. Because you want to make sure that if you're running it for this long, that your soil can infiltrate that much water at once. If you have a heavier clay soil, it might not be able to hold 2 3/4 inches of water if it's applied all at once. Now, if it is over almost 7 hours, maybe it can. But if it can't, what will happen is water will start to pool. And even if there's a slight slope in your yard, it'll start to run off in whatever direction that slope goes. So if it can't hold that much water at once, you might need to do something called cycle and soak. And what that is that's something that can be either built into an irrigation timer, or if you're doing it yourself manually, that would just mean water for part of that full amount of time, stop watering for a while, give it an hour or two to let the water start to absorb into the soil. And then after you've given it some time, start watering again. So if you have clay soil, if you have a slope, if you have both, you might need to break this into 3 or 4 different run times over the course of, for example, an early morning or a late evening into early morning. And most modern irrigation timers will have functions in there that you can program to facilitate that for you. If you are someone who is already up on your irrigation science, you might ask, well, for all of this, we're not accounting for the what's called distribution uniformity for the spray system, meaning that it doesn't perfectly even put all that water in the exact same spot. But again, because this isn't a lawn, and especially if you've been mulching, building good soil, I never add extra water for distribution uniformity, and my gardens do extremely well, grow well, yield well. So I'm going to save that extra water and not worried about it. And then we're going to get to right now talking about smart timers, also called weather-based timers, weather-based irrigation controllers. They all mean the same thing. If programmed correctly, the different brands have slightly different functions, but what they all have in common is if you program them correctly, you will be able to, for each zone of your irrigation system, so for each area that waters all at once when it turns a valve on, just program in that maximum runtime, and then making sure that you have those smart functions enabled. You need to make sure that in the preferences for that timer, they're turned on. What it will do is either through a sensor it's connected to that's in your yard, or through connecting to local weather stations through your home Wi-Fi system, depending on which timer it is, it will automatically track the recent weather. Some of them will even look forward at the weather predictions for next week, and it will adjust down from that maximum based on that. So those systems are going to be the most efficient way to save water. It will be more accurate than doing that just monthly average numbers that I've provided in that chart. And so for your irrigation timers, we're not going to get too much into timers. If you are interested in learning more about timers, I would encourage you to join our other more general irrigation classes. We just taught a basic introduction to irrigation class last weekend, and that presentation is up on our YouTube channel right now. We're going to be doing some additional ones throughout the summer. So take a look at those, sign up for those. But if you can't connect it to electricity, there are some battery options. There are not battery smart timer options because those need to be doing a bunch of other things. But the battery options do work pretty well. I've run gardens based on these multiple times, and you can do the monthly adjust. You'll just need to go in at the beginning of each month and hit something to adjust the percentage, but then it will apply to all of the zones on the timer. So these can be very useful if you don't have the ability to plug directly into a electrical source where your garden is. And then the smart timers, again, different brands are really going to be useful, not only because they can do those automatic adjustments, they can also be accessed by your phone on your computer. So the whole layout of where to make your adjustments, where to program it is much more intuitive than needing to like stand there in your garage and hit, only 4 buttons and have it be like programming an old VCR. So one that's common is one called Ratio. Some people have great success with this. To me, some of the options in this one, they don't quite give you the customization is the right word. Customization is a real word. Customizability is not. So that doesn't quite give you sometimes the customization that you might already want based on really having this knowledge that we've talked about today. Two that I do really like for these purposes are the Hunter HydroWise. There's these, and then there's some newer ones that are in outdoor enclosures that are a little bit more expensive. And then the least expensive one, but has some really nice options, is the Orbit Beehive. If you have, and then Rainbird brand just came out with one recently that has some of these smart functions as well. The Orbit's a really nice one, but it is limited in the number of different programs you can run. So that's not to say the valves, but the different schedules the valves can have. So if you have a lawn, a water-wise area, a native area, a vegetable area, and a fruit tree area, that's already 5. And the Orbit Beehive is, last I checked, was limited to 4. The Hunter and possibly the Rainbird, I don't know all the specs on that one, can do as many as you need. So that's something that I like about the flexibility there. And so the key thing, sorry, before we leave those, with those is even with all these smart functions, these are still going to be based on you needing to understand that maximum peak summer season runtime. And so you'll have the smart timer, but you need to set it up correctly, because if you don't set it up correctly, it will be making weather adjustments based on improper initial inputs. So even if you have a smart timer, you still need to be smart about how you set it up. And so we are getting towards the end of the water management section. Then what we'll do is we'll take a brief break, and then we will finish the class with looking at irrigation system examples and layouts of the different types. But all of that, again, needs to be based on this fundamental understanding. So this is water management. This is the water management part. That's what it takes. And the most important tool for water management is not a smart timer. It's not a fancy soil probe. It is your brain and understanding the basis of what you are doing, which hopefully now you have. And again, plenty of time for questions at the end to get into it more. Here's something that's important to understand as we are switching into talking about irrigation systems. Any landscape can be very high water and very inefficient, even if you have inefficient sprinklers. Even if you put in the most beautifully designed drip system that will never run off, a well-designed drip system can be a very efficient way to water way too much and waste a lot of water. Because if you have a well-designed drip system, one, it can actually sometimes put out water pretty quickly, but it puts it down in a way where it's going directly to the soil. There's not a lot of spray. And so if you're watering way too often, you might never notice it. You might not ever see any sign of it until maybe eventually the plants start to suffer from being watered too much and too frequently. So part of that water efficiency is not just having the hardware designed nicely, it's also you doing that proper water management. And then some other basic water management factors that are important is to turn off controllers when they're not needed. So after rain, make sure you turn things off. Some of the more modern timers have automatic rain turnoffs. One note about some of those modern timers, some those are a lot of their default settings are based on watering lawns. And so take some time to understand your timer. Most of the smart timers have really great YouTube tutorials, good information from the manufacturer now. Because, for example, I have at home that Hunter smart timer. And when I enable some of the smart functions, one of the things that it will want to do by default is automatically turn off watering zone. So it's just stop watering if there is as little as 0.1 inches of rain the day before. And sometimes at the beginning of our rainy season, we get those tiny sprinkle rain events. Well, if we have a lawn, it's cool and we get a little sprinkle, maybe we'll want to turn it off. But if we haven't watered for half a month and we're planning on doing a deep watering of over an inch of water, we don't necessarily want it to automatically turn off if we get 0.1 inches of rain. So check out all of those little things, and you want to turn off your controllers when they're not needed. But if there's some of those automatic trigger kind of things, take a look at them and make sure they make sense for which zone of your irrigation system it's controlling. And most of them, if you want it to treat like your lawn different than your fruit tree zone, you have that flexibility. Periodically check your systems for leaks or other issues, ideally once a month or so. I like to be very in touch with my garden. It's one of the reasons why for my vegetable beds, especially, I have them go off like when I'm getting ready for work in the morning, and I'll do a quick walkthrough. Usually, I also this time of year need to make sure I didn't miss a zucchini that's now 17 pounds and do a little bit of harvesting as well. So it's a good chance to just walk around, get in touch with your garden some, and don't be afraid of those irrigation controllers. Read the manual, look at YouTube videos. They're easier than you think, especially if you spend just a little bit of time looking at those tutorials. And so just 2 more slides, and then we will start our break. Plant establishment is something that we didn't talk about a lot. So these models are really focused on that. The plants are already rooted in what they're going to need long term. For the warm season, though, at the beginning of the warm season in the spring, we're going to be doing transplanting. We might be doing seeding. So here's my general guidelines. For annual vegetable seedlings or transplants, so that's little plugs that you might grow, 4-inch plants that you buy from the nursery, you can't let those dry out. So those are going to be watered right after they're transplanted, usually once a day. If it's hot weather, maybe more than that. You can be successful. I know people who have done it with a drip system doing that if you have a really large, like a farm. But what I prefer to do is I'll often do a succession planting where I'll have some stuff transplanted, other stuff that's more established. And so I'll usually keep my my drip system on that established schedule for the specific time of year. And then I'll go out and I will hand water my seedlings just to make sure that entire little root zone is well watered and never dries out until it can get its roots out and be on the same timing as the main system. For fruit trees, whether it's bare root, liners, or 5 gallons, usually that good once a week for the first few years. And then if it's very well established and you think it's well adapted for your soil, I like to go down to twice per month. I feel, especially in the harvest period, that little bit more dry down in between allows the fruit to sweeten more. However, it's going to be the same amount of total water overall. So if you have very sandy soil or you'd rather be doing it once a week, that's just fine. And then again, that's different from our water-wise plants, which are usually once a week for the first year and then gradually reducing to once or twice a month, depending on the plants after that. And remember that if you're hand watering, or even if you have a automatic irrigation system, you're thinking about how to set up your drip system, as your plants are growing in, you should be watering both the current plant and slightly beyond it, slightly wider out and slightly deeper, which is watering the soil where you want to train those roots to grow in and be nice and healthy. And then if you're really doing well, you might be able to beat these recommendations and save even more water. And the combination of trying to do that is mulching religiously, building soil organic matter with compost, not for water-wise and native plantings, but for our fruit trees and vegetable gardens, paying attention to soil and plant conditions, using your built-in digital moisture probe to stay in touch with what's going on in the soil, leave water off for as long as possible after the rain. And if your yard has the potential, thinking about when water especially comes off your roof and your driveway, is there a way to have your garden harvest and hold on to that water in your landscape? And maybe there's potential for some of that to then soak in, especially kind of around the outer edges of your fruit tree zone. And so, why all this matters? Well, here is a case study that we did of a local community garden where, based on their vegetable growing area, you could see what the recommended water use would be in blue, and their actual water use was in red. So watering on average about 4 times as much as they actually needed to water, all with the best of intentions. No one was trying to waste water. But because this is kind of nebulous to most people, without this fundamental, people just kind of water and they'll tend to err on the side of watering more. So not only will they get a lower quality crop with that much extra watering, but for this property, they were losing potential around a year, about $20,000 in water use. So they could save money and save water and have better crops. Proper watering promotes plant health. Many plant problems, especially diseases, fungal diseases, occur to overwatering. Some due to underwatering, even some insect problems. If we're overwatering, we have too much super tender growth, and that can attract aphids, scale, things like that. Watering appropriately protects our water resources. Collectively, it can help keep our water rates down, which means we can afford to continue to have things like vegetable gardens and orchards, has many other far-reaching environmental benefits, and it gives us the best yield and best tasting food. So with that, we have an hour left for the presentation. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then I will just grab a quick sip of water. I will get back and check on the questions in that break, but we'll start back up at like 11:07, let's say, and we will spend the rest of the time looking at specific examples of different irrigation system types, how to build them out, and then what that means in terms of how we use those charts to water. So if you have questions, feel free to type them in during the break, and we will pick up again very soon. All right, hello everybody. We are going to get started again. And right before we jump into the step-by-step examples, I want to show you just one additional resource, which is if you are either not local in inland Southern California, but still in California, or if you are in inland Southern California and either want to really keep up to date with what the local weather has been to do better than those monthly averages, or in a few years, want to see what the weather has been recently and maybe restart your chart or update it, you can use what's called CIMIS. This is something that's used by commercial farms that are doing really astute water management. It stands for the California Irrigation Management Information System. And this is a network of standardized weather stations, which are what creates those evapotranspiration reports that I use to create those charts. And so, first thing that you will need to do is find your local weather station or weather stations. To create my chart, I used a blend of our 2 local stations to our area, which are in Chino and Pomona. And the Chino one was relatively recently redeployed, so it didn't go back that many years. And so you can just zoom in on wherever you are on the map and get your local station numbers. And those are important. The numbers, I think, are just in the order that the stations were commissioned, so it doesn't necessarily mean anything geographically where they are. And so once you have your number, what you can do is you can generate reports. So let's just say, because I don't want to poke around here, that you wanted, we would never want probably Fresno and Bishop at the same time. But let's just say we wanted to get information for those 2. What you can do is you can do an hourly report is probably not what we would need. If you are really, really wanting to track your daily evapotranspiration that you need to replace more accurate than those monthly averages, say you're running an urban farm or something like that, this is beyond what I do. I stick with that chart that I used, and it works very well for me. But if you really wanted to do that, you can do that daily report and run the report. And for those weather stations, there we go. It will give you the last week. And for that station, you will get the daily evapotranspiration. If there was rainfall, if you're getting in the season where, remember, rainfall would replace the irrigation you need to put down, it'll give you that as well, but it will give you the daily evapotranspiration. So if you're going to water after a week and you really want to do it extremely accurately to replace what's been lost, you can add up a week's worth of stuff, and then you can get your total. And then if you're using this to create your monthly chart, what you can do is you can select a couple of them, whichever ones are going to be relevant to you, and you can do a monthly report. And you can get them by the months. And then also in here, there is a way, and I am not pulling it up right now, and I thought it was in this interface, but it must be somewhere else, that you can pull weather data even farther back. So then if you want to create your chart throughout the year, you can access those records as well. So that's CIMIS. And if you just Google CIMIS irrigation, it'll pull up this exact website for you. So if you need to figure that out or want that as a resource, that's another great resource. So getting back into it. Resetting up my interface. So, and I'm just noticing that there are some new questions that came in, so we will answer just a couple of questions before we do jump into it. So Gladys had a question about auditing a drip system in a vegetable garden. It's not working well. Some areas are dry and others are wet. The soil is clay. So the main thing you would need to do for a drip system is pull back all of the mulch. It's going to be easiest to do between seasons, but if you need to do it now, it's no time like the present, pull back any mulch or things, run it, and just really pay attention and spend some time out there going from area to area, digging around with a trowel, seeing if over time, especially if you don't have adequate filtration or you have not been cleaning out your filters, you need filtration with a drip system. Things can start to get clogged. You might need to flush, or you might need to replace parts of it. And then if you have further questions, you can give me more specifics at the very end of the presentation, and I can try to give you some more specific advice. From Eunice. So you and your neighbor are both having powdery mildew problems, tried solutions, want to avoid neem oil because possible injury to bees. That's great. Any recommendations? So the number one recommendation for powdery mildew is that is encouraged by wet foliage. So drip irrigation is going to be your biggest ally in avoiding powdery mildew. So this is actually a good transition to our systems because we're going to be choosing between drips and sprays. So drip irrigation is going to be your best against powdery mildew. If you're doing hand watering, especially for things like squash, cucumbers, and tomatoes, watering at the base using an on-off switch on a watering rod to try to keep the leaves dry, definitely not having the leaves be wet overnight. And then also realizing that if you planted zucchini in the spring, by this time of year, you will have powdery mildew no matter what you do. It's kind of just part of the natural life cycle, maybe some on cucumbers too. So one of my zucchini plants, we've considered it has run its course, had powdery mildew, even with drip irrigation, foliage never getting wet. By now, another one, we've been pruning some of the older leaves as they start to get powdery mildew and disposing of them. It's kept it going pretty well. And then we always plan for the things that are really prone to it, zucchini and cucumbers. We do a second planting, a succession planting, because that's just part of the you're not going to be able to do anything to really prevent it. And then we're getting some more specific questions. I'm going to hold all those questions till the end, but we will get all around from that. We will get all around to them at the end. But we need to jump into these specific systems to make sure we have time to cover them. So the first thing when you start to think about building out a system is the question is going to be, how are you going to get water to your system? Now, for most home vegetable gardeners, even if you have a big vegetable gardener or fruit trees, I do recommend connecting with a anti-siphon valve. That's the main kind of residential valve, and we'll look at those in a little bit, to an irrigation timer. Even if you're not doing things automatically, so sometimes, depending on the week, the time of year, I will tell the timer when I want it to water. I don't necessarily just set it and forget it because I like to be very involved. But what the timer lets you do is not have to remember to turn something on, turn something off. Since I have a Wi-Fi enabled controller, it's in my garage, but my Wi-Fi signal reaches. I can, on my phone, tell it which zone I want to water for how long. And sometimes if I know that I want to add a little extra water in the morning, I can do that even before I get out of bed. So that just makes things really useful. And I am the kind of person who will forget to turn off a hose bib. So that helps me because I'm telling it how long to water and then stop. But I have had gardens, and even for my garden, when I first built it out, before I got the automatic system set up, where it can be run off of a hose bib. So it could be a hose bib. If you have a drip or high pressure, you will need a pressure regulator, and you can do this with adapters. And if you have drip, you will definitely need a filter, but you can connect it either like this, or you can even have this assembly out in the garden and run a hose between a hose bib to this. If you are running things off of a hose bib, important thing you need to understand is the difference between hose thread and pipe thread. And depending on the parts you buy, you can get any of these parts in hose thread or pipe thread if you're buying them online. If you go to the local irrigation supply store, wherever you are, there will be a local specialty irrigation and landscape supply store, which mostly serves the landscape industry, but they will sell to homeowners, and they're usually quite helpful to homeowners. Most of the stuff is normally going to come in pipe thread. And then at the very end, pipe thread looks similar if you look at it quickly, but pipe thread is actually closer together than the thread that a hose uses on the connections. And if you try to put them together, you are going to damage both pieces and make parts not work. So what you need to do is you need to get an adapter piece at some point in time that will convert hose thread to pipe thread. And I will show you examples of that as we look at a specific example. Now, if you are working off of hoses, you can also get a hose end timer, which doesn't have a lot of those advanced functions, but will automatically turn off or can do some basic automated functions if you program it. In some cases, these are better than having no timer options. If I've used these when I was renting a place and just didn't have a lot of budget, didn't know how long I was going to be there. And especially if you're going to be like leaving town on vacation, definitely they help. The actual components of the valve in here are pretty low quality. They're pretty cheesy in most cases. I've taken them apart and it's amazing that they work at all. So this is really just kind of a stopgap measure. The better solution if you don't have electricity would be to put in standard valves and have a battery operated timer for that. But these, if you have to have a hose and that's just what it's going to be, these hose end timers can help, but they only last a couple of years, usually at the most, and they get expensive and frustrating to replace. So what's going to be the best solution for most of us long-term is going to be to have a standard residential valve. There's a lot of different brands. The Home Depot brands are generally, the cheaper ones are generally not going to last you that long. A couple of like common higher quality brands would be Rainbird makes good ones, Hunter makes good ones. And the price difference between the real cheapo ones that are going to break and the more professional ones are not that different and will protect you in the long run. I mean, you could easily have a valve problem that will waste so much water in a couple of months. That'll be all the difference between having bought a better valve. And these are the style that comes up out of the ground and goes back down and has those two kind of lobes. Those are called anti-siphon valves. Those are what we want to use as homeowners if we don't have a large scale backflow prevention device on our property. And for us homeowners in California, that's going to be the vast majority of us. What these do is they're anti-siphon. So they prevent when the water turns off, water being able to accidentally be sucked back into the water system, where then it might come out through the tap inside the house into our drinking water, also protects the overall water supply. Especially if we have drip irrigation in our gardens, that actually can happen. And so we do want to make sure we use these. If you see, like in a commercial landscape, the valves are in the ground in a valve box, it looks maybe cleaner, but those have a large and expensive and need to be checked by a professional every year backflow preventer, which means they don't need this anti-siphon part. So for residential, we're going to need this. And then to work properly, what we want to do is these are going to be coming out of the ground, and we want these to work properly to be sited where the valve is a foot higher than where the irrigation is actually coming out of on the plant. So some of these might need to be even higher. And it's just going to depend. So if you have a huge slope, for these to work properly, your valve would need to be at the top of the slope, because if this is at the bottom of the slope, it's not going to work properly. And then for especially drip systems, we are going to need a filter, because drip systems can clog even if our municipal water is pretty clean, but even just a little bit of a grit in the line from construction could clog them. So you need a filter, and you need to remember to flush that out. Usually every 6 months is plenty if you have city water. If you have well water, might need to be quite a bit more. And a pressure regulator, because drip products and even sprays are meant to work at a certain pressure. And there will be specifications for whatever product you're using. And you need to get a pressure regulator, which uses kind of that amount, or that will get it to that amount of pressure. And if you don't have a whole house pressure reducer that gets the irrigation system as well. In most cases, it won't get the irrigation system. Even for sprays, you might need a pressure reducer, which will still keep it at a higher pressure, but gets to the range that your sprays are meant to work with. So first thing we're going to look at is a high efficiency spray system for fruit trees. This is generally my go-to for fruit trees. And when we talk about high efficiency spray systems, we're not talking about this. This is an old style lawn sprinkler, a lot of misting, and spray technology has come a long way for sprinklers. What we're talking about is using high efficiency rotating nozzles. These work on the same general architecture. For our fruit trees, they're going to be held up higher, but these are individual streams, some which go farther, some which go closer, and they don't have misting. They're a more direct stream of water, so much more of the water goes where it's intended. There's a number of different brands that make them. Yeah, they are a good option for efficient overhead spray if you're going to be using overhead spray in the landscape. And so for fruit trees, one of the reasons why I tend to use these for fruit trees is because I don't like to just have mulch underneath my fruit trees and then have to do a bunch of weeding. I tend to grow a lot of understory planting. So plants under and around the fruit trees that are compatible with the irrigation. Depending on which part of my orchard it is, in one area, I have lots of Mediterranean herbs, some edible flowers, things like that. I'll let some vegetables that will just kind of come up every year from seed, like arugula, grow there as well. And then in my main section of my nursery, I have a native meadow underneath my fruit trees, which brings lots of beneficial insects that will eat my pest insects and looks beautiful. And so because of that, we can't have those little pop-ups like in the lawn. And so what I do is I build them on a solid riser, sometimes called a nipple. I use at least a 2-foot one to get the sprinklers 2 feet above the ground. And then instead of a pop-up, you can use a part called a shrub adapter and then your sprinkler. And so these are able to spray above the plants that are in the understory. If the plants start getting very big, you might need to do a little trimming. And some parts of my orchard, I've actually added another 2 feet onto it. And then my favorite approach to stabilize that is to use a 2-foot section of rebar, which you can get pre-cut at either the big box hardware store or the irrigation supply store, and to use one of those little metal worm gear clamps. This is a very, very stable, long-lived system. It's easy to turn on once a month and audit and make sure that there's nothing wrong. And if this is constructed well, eventually the piping goes under mulch. It should last a very, very long time with very minimal maintenance, less maintenance and a little bit more reliable long-term than a drip system, even though it's a little bit less efficient at getting the water in the exact right place. But overall, I'll water the same amount for either system. So I'm not effectively going to be using more water with either system. If you're thinking about sprays, and this is for either edible gardens or for general landscaping, one important concept that a lot of people don't realize is that the correct way to install spray sprinklers is that the spray from each nozzle or riser goes all the way to hit the one closest to it. So that's called head-to-head spacing. And those overlapping streams of water is how they are engineered to water evenly. Sometimes we will see spray systems installed where the outer part of the stream from one nozzle just hits the outer part from another nozzle, and that won't give you an even watering. That's not how sprinklers are engineered to work. And so this is a kind of abstract picture, but it's illustrative. If you have a square area, so that's when it'd be like for an orchard, but this might be for a lawn or a landscape area, you're going to have an overlapping pattern like this, where each spray will hit the one closest to it. And so this is the installation of one of the orchard zones of the current place where I live. Was put in maybe a year and a half ago now, a year ago spring. So a little less than a year and a half. So this is a head-to-head high efficiency spray system using blue lock pipe instead of PVC pipe, using those Hunter MP1000 nozzles. We looked at the chart for those earlier. It's a high efficiency spray, rotating nozzle. And this will provide even watering over the entire area, which is good in this case because I'm growing lower plants under and around the trees. And so blue lock pipe is something that I really like to use. It's easy to use. It's more flexible than PVC. There's no glues. It's not completely non-toxic, but you can't buy it in local stores. It's a bit of a specialty product. It can be ordered online from multiple places. The easiest one that I've ordered from that I know consistently has it is a place called Drip Depot. It's not an official endorsement. I will never endorse one specific company, but when I don't provide sources, people often comment that they don't know where to get it. So I'll mention some additional sources as well for online parts as we go. And a lot of those places, if you order like over $50, it's free shipping. So it's really easy to work with. It doesn't necessarily cost more than buying it in the store. I love to support our local independent landscape supply stores, but they just don't carry this stuff. So the reason why I like this blue lock pipe is it's really easy to work with, as you will see. So this is my very young fruit tree zone. We wanted to get the fruit trees planted in our first spring. Didn't want to wait since it takes a few years till they'll start really producing for us. So haven't even mulched, still weedy, have a few of the understory plantings in, and we had just been hand watering. So now it's time to set up. And so the first thing we did was measure things out, and you will see an overhead drawing. But first thing we did is put flags where they were going to go. So we started with this, and this was looking from the other side, and we are going to irrigate this area. So here is a key irrigation design rule, and this is for landscape irrigation. This is for edible irrigation, whatever. So for a 3/4 inch pipe, which is going to be the main pipe size that we would use, whether it's a PVC pipe or this blue lock stuff, because most of our residential properties, if we don't have a very large property, we're going to have a 3/4 inch or 5/8 inch meter. And so 3/4 inch valve and piping is going to be practically the largest that we'd probably use. And we need to keep the rate of water below 8 gallons per minute flowing through that. And so the more irrigation demand, the more sprays, the more water you're putting through a system to keep up with that demand, the water needs to flow faster. And there's going to be a limit to how much the system could even provide. But you will, in general, if you're in a city under pressure, if you're in the country on a well, it's a little different. But if you're in the city under pressure, you will be able to provide more than that maximum flow. But the maximum flow you want to put through a 3/4 inch pipe is 8 gallons of water per minute. Under 7 is even a little bit better, because if it goes faster than that, you can get what's called water hammer, which is when there are turns in the direction. The water's moving so fast, it can physically damage over time your irrigation system. It can lead to leaks. If you're in a house with old plumbing and you turn on the water and you hear a pounding, that's the water hammer, and that's bad. So we will do some math to make sure that we are sizing everything to stay underneath that threshold. And then you also want to test your flow to make sure that your system can bring that demand. And so the easiest way to do that is to connect to just a hose bib somewhere before you're building out your irrigation system and fill up a 5-gallon bucket and time it. And then based on that, if your flow exceeds that 8 gallons per minute, you'll know that you'll be able to use up to that amount. Most properties will easily exceed that minimum, but it's good to be sure. If you have really old pipes where there's corrosion on the inside, that might slow things down. I've rented a place where that was the issue, but in most houses, you will be able to exceed that. You also want to test your water pressure. So in this case, 150 PSI. This was the water pressure on an audit that we did when I moved into my house. It was, I think, 130 PSI, way, way too high. And so the range that these high efficiency spray sprinklers are engineered to work at are 30 to 40 PSI. 40 is around the sweet spot for them. 30 to 40 is just fine. And so you're going to need to reduce that. A typical irrigation valve from a high quality manufacturer is rated to work up to 150 PSI. Beyond that, they can literally explode when you turn the water on. Components can pop apart. And at that pressure, your spray systems will not work well and it will wear things out prematurely. If you have slightly high pressure, 60, 80, you can just put a pressure reducer after your valve. If you have very high pressure, you're going to want to make sure that you capture the entire irrigation system. So for example, for my property, I had very high pressure. What I did is there's a whole line pressure reducer going into the house. At that point where the water is coming into the house, I found when I was digging around when I moved to my house, there's also the main branch off where it goes to the irrigation system, which was not captured. I installed another one of those whole line pressure reducers. It's a different style than the irrigation ones. It's brass. Wilkins is the common brand. You can get them at any hardware store. I installed that to bring the pressure on the whole system down to a reasonable rate for my spray systems. And then I only needed to install further pressure reducers for my drip zones. If all of your valves are going to be in one place for your irrigation system, you could do the same thing and install one of those brass, like Wilkins style pressure reducers right before all of your valves and have that work as well. If you're not the type of person to do that, you can work with a plumber to do that. But oftentimes plumbers, they'll have the skills to do it, but they're not used to working on the irrigation system. So you might need to know what you're asking for, which is why I'm telling you this, to get them to do it. So usually your water pressure will be too high and you might need to do something about it. That's basically what this slide says. Your next step is going to be to design out your system on paper. And so you'll need a few things. You'll need to know what you're going to be irrigating. So here we had already planted the fruit trees. If you're in the planning phase, it's never a bad idea to have your irrigation system in even first. But if you're in the planning phase, then you can just kind of draw it out schematically, take some site measurements. You're going to do your design, need to know what exact spray sprinklers you're going to be able to use. Or you're going to plan to use, because depending on which brand of sprinkler you get, even which model, they're going to be putting out a different amount of water, gallons per minute and gallons per hour. And you're going to need to know that to size things correctly. So here again, we said we were going to do the MP1000s. And the reason why is because in my full grown fruit trees in my backyard, I like to plant things 13 feet apart. It keeps things relatively manageably small with the pruning, but big enough that I feel like I have a tree there, have some presence in the yard. And I don't need to do a lot of climbing up into the tree, but I can stand on a small ladder at the most and do my harvesting. In another area of my yard, I have everything smaller and things are about 10 feet apart. It's dwarf citrus and some other trees I'm going to keep smaller. And so for that, I used a different, same brand, same kind of sprinkler, but that I need to use a different one. That was the MP800s because they stay smaller. But again, their flow rates and even their precipitation rates are different. So you need to know your specifications. And with that, here was this main section of my orchard where I was going to have a certain number of fruit trees that were all going to be the same spacing, same irrigation demand. So I just drew it out. This is not to scale necessarily. This is just schematic. And then I drew where my sprinklers were going to be. So I wanted to have that head-to-head coverage. So if this was a commercial orchard, there might just be one sprinkler in between each tree, and it's not going to be as even of watering, but it would be fine just for the tree. But for me, because I also want my orchard to be a beautiful landscape, to have that habitat for the beneficial insects, to have that nice meadow underneath. I want to get full coverage. And the roots of the fruit trees will grow out to use this whole area as the root zone, but I want things to be as evenly as possible. So this is almost a more landscape style irrigation system. And so what I did is I knew that I needed to have a 180-degree spray every place where I have this little cross in the circle, and I filled in half of it. This is the direction it's spraying to, again, have that head-to-head coverage. And then in the corners, I only need it to be a 90-degree spray. And so at this point in time, I don't yet know if I'm going to need one valve or two valves. That's why I need to do the math. And so based on those specifications, we will go back. On these specifications, you can see if you have it set to, and these are adjustable, this one, between 90 and 180 degrees and anything in between. There's a slightly different model. It's still the MP1000 series, light blue. You can see here that does 210 to 270 degrees. So I have one area where it turns and I need 3/4. And then if for some reason you wouldn't in this setup need a 360, you can do that. But even though it's adjustable, based on how much of an arc it's irrigating, there's going to be a different number of gallons per minute. And so for our 90s, at about 40 psi, you can see here, because based on your pressure, more pressure will put out a little more water. Based on this, you can see that's going to be putting out 0.21 gallons per minute for each 90 degree. And for 180 degrees, it's twice that. It's twice as much area, 0.42. So I'm going to have all that written down here, because what I'm doing is I'm going to be sizing my different zones based on how many of these sprinklers I can get on without exceeding that 8 gallons per minute flow. So I do that, and then I start doing math. So what I'll do is next to each sprinkler, I'll write out the amount of gallons per minute each sprinkler is going to put out. And then I'll start just here, I just added kind of across here, start breaking down the math so that I can start adding things up to figure out how many sprinklers I can get onto one valve or one 3/4 inch line at a time without exceeding that maximum velocity. And so as I started adding things up, what I figured out is I would get on this side of the orchard, I would get up to 6.3 gallons per minute. So I wasn't going to be able to do over all of it on one zone. And then on this side, I would do 3.78. And so if you want to, you can split it evenly here and here. On this side, I wanted to maintain a little bit of room to expand the irrigation system in the future if I needed to. So this is how I decided to do my split. Now, because these all have the same water demand, I will always be watering these at the same time. I will water one zone first and then immediately water the next zone. And so because of that, it's just fine that I have this sprinkler going halfway here, this sprinkler going halfway here, because the total water will still all add up the same way. It's just not going to be able to do it all at once. And then the other thing is, remember that 8 gallons per minute is a total maximum. So if you're going to be showering, average shower head, it's around 2 gallons per minute, doing laundry at the same time, anything like that. And that will all still go on the same main line for your whole property. So, 6-ish, really, if you're a typical, like, smaller, medium-sized residential lot, and you have that 3/4 inch or 5/8 inch water meter and main line going into your house as well, around 6 leaves you some more capacity to keep that water speed down without worrying about taking a shower, things like that. And then if you don't want to do that math, know that if you are just kind of emulating my system with those MP1000 nozzles, you can generally fit a maximum of up to 16, those 180-degree half circles, or 14 half circles, and then for the corners, 4 90s on one zone. So quickly looking at the build out. So we started here, and this is what we're going to be building. So as we looked at the solid risers, the well-adjusted sprays all going in the right direction. And then eventually this line will be covered completely in mulch. With this blue lock, it's more flexible. It's a little more tolerant of the sun. So you don't need to do all of that trenching. It's not a bad idea to do the trenching if you want to, but you don't absolutely have to if you're committed to keeping things covered in mulch. And in fact, if you need to make a repair, it can make things easier. So part of my yard, I did trenching, part of it I did not. So flagging out with your measuring tape where each spray is going to go. And then I hit those rebar stakes in to start out with. I never do that well in advance and then wait a few days to put my sprinklers in because this is a hazard. You don't want someone to trip and fall on a stake of rebar. So I'll do that. I'll hit it in about halfway. And so here are all my sprinkler locations on both sides. Then I will do some pre-assembly. So I will do those 24-inch solid sprinkler risers. Those are my shrub adapters to get to the right thread that the sprinkler nozzles can screw right onto. Using Teflon tape, which you will put on. That's that little white tape that you get in the roll. If you need to know how to put it on, normally I'll demonstrate this when we're doing in-person classes, but you can look up on YouTube easily how to put Teflon tape on a pipe. It's a little bit awkward when you first start doing it, but then it's just muscle memory and it gets very easy. And I will pre-assemble all of my risers because anything I can do sitting at a table in the shade it makes it that much easier. You're not sitting in the dirt trying to assemble things in the sun. And so these are going to be the pieces that work with that blue lock system that are going to be the adapters that go from the blue lock 3/4 inch pipe. This is a reducing tee is what it's called. The blue lock 3/4 inch pipe onto the pipe thread for this riser. And then you just screw those in there after you put the Teflon tape on. Then I'll lay them out at each of the locations. I'll also go through and so this is the location where the loop of pipe that goes all the way around to feed all the sprinklers was going to head up into the rest of my backyard to get to the water source. So if there's angle changes, other things like that, I'll tend to lay out the fittings ahead of time to just have them there. So as I'm running my pipe and concentrating on what I'm doing at hand, I'll run into those and remember that I need to cut the pipe and insert that as well. And then this is the blue lock pipe. It can be purchased online from Drip Depot as well as other sellers. And you can, look around online for the best price. The black fittings are also that blue lock brand. And it comes in a 100-foot coil. And then what you want to do is when you cut open the coil, and this is for drip line, for anything like that, a trick is you only cut the inside of the coil and you pull the pipe from the inside. And that way the rest of the coil can stay together more or less. And you only unroll it from the inside. It's a lot less likely to kind of fall apart on you. It makes your work quite a bit easier. Laying it out is super easy if you have two people, one person to hold the coil, and then one person who's taking the pipe from them and doing the connections. The connections with the blue lock, there's no glue involved. There's a little rubber gasket and some metal teeth, and you just push it in and you kind of feel it click in, and then it's done and it's watertight. And so this blue lock pipe is great for anything after the valve. It's not meant for main lines. It's not meant for anything that's going to be constantly pressurized all the time. But if you have an irrigation valve, or even if you're connecting to it with a hose, then it's not pressurized, and then the system is always running when it's on. That's the proper application for these. And you can just cut it with a normal PVC pipe cutter. The pipe is a little bit more flexible, and then you just push it on. And even on there, one of the advantages it has to over gluing is that the pieces, even after they're on and watertight, can rotate a little bit, and the pipe can flex a little bit too. So it's a little easier to work with. And so if you have a direction change, so that's like right here, the pipe is going inline to feed the sprinklers, and then it's going to head up that way to get the supply. It's just called a 3/4 inch blue lock T. And then for that supply, in this case, we did not yet have our valves installed. So for the time being, we were just going to connect to it with a hose. And then we were going to still use the same timing recommendations that I showed you. I was just going to have to start an alarm on my phone when I put it all together and turn the hose bib on to remember to turn it off after the same point in time. So if you aren't quite there yet with the valves, or if it's just not functional for the site, you can absolutely do that with the hose if you need to. And so this is the adapter that would let me do that. This connects to the blue lock on this right side, and then to the male pipe thread on the other side. Teflon tape goes on. And then this is the adapter. So this adapter goes from on the the side that looks like you can use a wrench on it with a male pipe thread, and then on the other side with the rubber gasket, the female pipe thread to connect to the male pipe thread that I just showed you. And then on the other side with the gasket, a hose thread. So that lets me connect a hose to it. You will not find this at the local big box hardware store in most cases, although you definitely want to get the brass ones. The plastic ones don't hold up long term. And when you connect it into the metal of a hose, the plastic ones tend to strip. But the brass ones are available from pretty much any local landscape specialty supply store. You can just Google wherever you are, landscape supply, and you'll find many options. So that's the other side that connects into the hose. And again, this is something that you can fit together ahead of time. And then you just stick that on. And then this is where I would connect my hose to make things go. You don't want to get dirt or anything in there. And so what you can get, which you need to special order online, I've been most lucky just finding them on Amazon, is you can get a little threaded cap. But for this, you need to make sure your cap is hose thread. So the irrigation stores will have plenty of pipe thread caps, but you need a hose thread cap. And so this is it, everything together, but I don't put the sprinkler nozzles on yet. What I do is, skipped over that too quickly, I flush the system. So I turn the water on and I wait till water is coming out through as many of these individual risers as I can. So if there's any little bit of dirt, piece of mulch, piece of plant that got in there, insect, it's not going to clog my sprinkler nozzles. I'm going to flush that out after I have everything assembled. And what'll happen is, depending on your water flow, you might get 3 or 4 of these to go, and then you'll have to put your sprinkler nozzles on, and then you'll flush it, see which other ones the water comes out of, and get going from there. So here are the ones I was mainly using, those Hunter MP1000s. They look like that, and they have a little internal filter to help this nozzle from getting clogged, because those can just snap off and you can rinse them out every once in a while. I mean, most of the time for a well-built system on city water, that's every couple of years. But in my system, the one at the end of the line, I've already had to flush out once, just because any little dirt and grit normally accumulates at the end of the line. And so we're flushing and then putting them on, and then, apologize, this picture's out of focus, but then when you just have them screwed on, they're going to be facing in any random direction. They're not necessarily, because they're adjustable, going to have the right adjustment. So this one in the corner, for example, I wanted 90 degrees pointing in this direction. So then need to adjust them. You can, by screwing this silver outer ring, you can adjust the angle. So get it down from like 180 to 90. And then if you need to adjust how far it's going, there's a little flathead screw at the top that can adjust the distance. And there we go. And that's it when it's young. Later on, I built my valve manifold, which is beyond what we can cover in this class, but we will over time provide some resources for that. If you're comfortable with gluing pipe, it's something you can do at home. If not, it's pretty easy to build out the rest of this. This might be something to hire a landscaper to do for you, because this is permanently under pressure. If there's leaks, if it blows, it can cause damage. And then after I got that in, connected the pipe. This part, because it was going to be long-term under paths, I did do the trenching for. And then just cut that off, put on a little coupler, connected that. And then this is the orchard kind of growing in, my native meadow coming in underneath. And then this whole area, as these trees grow in, this whole width is going to be root zone and area for the trees. And so this is the corner of my native meadow, nice little seating area as well. Lots of beautiful native plants, some that attract monarch butterflies and that attract beneficial insects to help eat the aphids off of our young citrus that's growing in. And still has a lot of growing to do. So then you can, once you have that system, I'm just going to go through this really quick. I just put this in for the slides. Again, remember, so now you have that system put in by the book. You can check with the cans if you want. So that system is going to be the 0.4 inches per hour. And this is the exact same thing I ran you through before. But if you're referring to this as a reference in the future, emulating this, I just wanted to put this math right here for you. And then again, if you're having a smaller distance, you're keeping your tree smaller, that's that other MP800 product, which has a different color to keep it color coded. This one I'm going to go through super fast. It's mostly here for you to have the slides, because I need to get on in our last minutes to the other main system, which is the drip tape for vegetables. You can do inline drip irrigation. You would use the same drip irrigation that you would use for like landscape irrigation for fruit trees if you just want it all to be directly on the ground, especially if you have kind of a fruit tree here, a fruit tree there, or just one or two fruit trees in an otherwise lower water vegetable garden, or sorry, otherwise lower water landscape garden. Drip is a great way to go. Our next class coming up in 2 weeks is going to be all about drip irrigation for home landscapes and using the techniques that that whole class will focus on with the water demand charts and timing that we talked about. You can learn much more about how to build out a full drip system like this. So either join that class if you really want to spend more time focusing on it, or check the YouTube video of that class afterwards if you're interested in that. But the key thing is that you're going to buy a high quality inline drip tube. And these are not just holes in a tube. These are highly engineered emitters so that each hole puts out the exact same rate of water at the same time. There's many different brands. I don't really like the brands that are usually in stock at the big box hardware store, but two kind of top brands are Rainbird and Netafim. And then there's a few other brands around as well. Most of them are very similar. The fittings, which are barbs that insert just with pressure, are compatible. The one thing for people who maybe haven't done this before, I like about the Rainbird brand fittings is that they have a patented system where they have this tool that only costs a few bucks. And these things, because it can be kind of hard to push them in, these things are meant to, there's a little extra ridge and it snaps into this tool. And then you can have your palm behind this kind of pad here and get more leverage on it. You don't want to use these little things. These are the things that are, they sell them everywhere, but they definitely sell them all the way down the aisle in the big box hardware store. If you get like a vegetable garden drip irrigation kit, it'll have these. They go from the larger line to the smaller 1/4-inch tube to these individual drippers. We do this audit program where we help people with their irrigation systems. We have never seen one of these systems that hasn't had many of these little things fall off, fall apart. When you do that, there's open tube. The pressure is off. It's just a mess. They're super high maintenance, and they don't even do what you want them to do. Because normally what happens is there's just one or two of these at the base of a plant. And so you put two of these at the base of your fruit trees. And if you're really careful, maybe three. When it's young, you can have it work. But as that tree grows, remember those images of how and where the tree wants to gather water from its roots. You would need to start adding more and more and more of these to where you might have to have tube for like 50 of these emitters, if not more, underneath your fruit tree. Nobody does that. So what basically happens is that encourages the tree to only have roots at the base of the tree. The tree is not happy long term. And even like a Santa Ana wind event, they can blow over. Seen it happen. And so you can either lay it out with spirals underneath each tree like this, or you generally, what I would do, like if I was doing a drip version of the zone that I just showed you at my house, I would do something like this and the trees would be planted down the middle. So grid over the whole root zone, just like it rained, to fill in that whole root zone, like it's raining, just not going through the air. And so I'm not going to walk you through this whole installation because we don't have time, but you can use the same. You're still going to want to use, if you do a decent size zone, that 3/4-inch pipe. Here we have purple pipe just because this is our demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center, and recycled water, which is what we use, needs to have purple pipe. But essentially coming from the valve or from the hose, this would be just that same blue lock pipe, same fittings. Down on the far side, you will be creating what's called a manifold with using those same fittings that adapt to that 1/2-inch pipe thread like your risers. But here you're going to be adapting onto those barbs. So these barbs will have the thread on one side and the barb on the other. So those are going to be the fittings. The spacing will be different depending on your soil type, and I'll show you a chart for that in just a second. And then you cut out your drip line and you insert it and you just kind of put it together, and it's going to wave around a little bit. And then eventually you'll use those drip staples, or sometimes called drip staples or jute staples, and they'll hold this in place. They're those little metal hoops. And so that's basically what you're building. Nice thing about it that you can't do with sprinklers is you can kind of evenly water little fussy areas. And then same thing, you need to be able to flush it. So down at the end, you put what's called a ball valve, which is threaded. So you just have another one of those threaded adapters like we used on the last system for connecting the hose. And the first time you turn it on, you have that valve open, you flush the water out, and then you close it. And then you have your nice even system. And so based on whether you have clay, loam, or sand, here is a little chart that will show you for your soil type. And in most of our valley areas, even if we're a little bit loamy, commonly we will use sand. It just depends on what we do. So what I tend to do is I will go with the 0.9 gallons per hour emitters. So the thing will look exactly the same, but when you buy it from the irrigation supply store, you're going to tell them, I want this emitter to match your soil type, this spacing down the line embedded. And this is the most common one you'll find in stock locally, 0.9 gallons per hour, 12 inches. And then I will lay them out if I have slightly loamy soil at 18 inches in between each row. If you have very, very sandy or like rocky Rancho Cucamonga Claremont soil, probably 12 inches in between each one. If you have clay soil, you're going to have, because remember that water is going to spread out more and it's going to take longer to absorb, you're going to use this set. Here's a little guide right here to understand if your soil's wet, if you feel it, what kind of soil type you have. And so you can refer back to this on the posting. And so with that, you can then use this chart that we looked at briefly earlier to get, if you have it, again, you remember you're going to need to have your pressure reducer to have the right pressure. And then that will tell you, for example, we're going to be using 18 inches in between, 12-inch emitter spacing, 0.9 gallons per hour. We're going to be at just about 1 inch per hour. And then we are going to use that chart. And then you're going to need that pressure regulation and that filter. And if you're doing this kind of irrigation, you can have it in one piece. That's going to be either 30 or 40 PSI. If your valve is close to the area being irrigated, you can use 30. If it's far away, go with 40, because as the water goes through that pipe, it's going to lose a little bit of pressure. And so that's what it would look like. And so for people who want to refer to some of this other math, I don't have time to explain it, but if you're really wanting to customize doing something different than what we're talking about, then I just wanted to put this in here for the math inclined that you can refer back to that. Because we're running short on time, I'm not going to go through this, but this is exactly what we did for the fruit tree zone, figuring out the timing of how long to water, but using that specifications for how far or how much the drip emitters water and those inches per hour. Because in the last bit of time, we are going to need to switch over to vegetables, and same concepts, just a slightly different product for drip. And this might go slightly after 12. It's the first time I've taught all of this sort of stuff in one workshop. So I apologize if we go a little bit over. But for those of you who need to move on to other things on your Saturday, this will all be posted on YouTube for you to review at your leisure. So, vegetable irrigation basics. This is basically just, if you're going through the slides later, going to be reviewing our basics. One slightly different way to think about it for vegetables is, at our peak in July in our area, roughly 8 inches of water for the month, you are basically going to need to replace 1/4 of an inch of water per day in evapotranspiration. So if you think of the basics of a typical 4-foot by 8-foot raised bed, it's 5 gallons a day you need to replace. So if you're thinking about, there's a question about using a hose, for your peak watering season, that's basically what you're going to be at, is for a typical 4x8 planting area, the time it takes you on your hose, how you have it set up, how fast you have the water going to fill a 5-gallon bucket for every day. So if you're waiting 3 days, 3 times that amount. So that's the basics for that manual watering. If you start thinking about that, it's going to take you a very long time to water a garden of any decent size if you're watering twice a week, which is why drip irrigation is the way to go for most vegetable gardens. This is the product that I prefer by far for drip irrigation for vegetable gardens. This is the same product that's used on most commercial farms using drip irrigation for their vegetables. It's called drip tape, or sometimes called T-tape. It's similar in concept to our landscape irrigation tubing with a couple of differences. This actually comes shipped, and when there's no water in it, it lays flat. And then it inflates when water goes into it. That in itself isn't important to me. What is important to me is that our landscape irrigation drip line, unless you're custom ordering like a mile of drip line, you are not going to reliably find that for purchase with the emitters spaced any closer than 1 foot apart, which is far too far apart for a vegetable garden. What you are going to want is a drip product with the emitters embedded down the line, either in most cases 6 inches or 8 inches apart. And because these products are manufactured specifically for agriculture, you can buy these almost always online with those spacings. I know out in Riverside, there's a fruit growers supply that has some of these products, but I'm not sure they have the ones with the specification I like. You can find out. But again, you can order these online and get free shipping if you're doing, anything more than a very small garden. Emitters are pretty much the same thing, engineered to have that even flow rate. And so you're going to want to specify those same sorts of things as we looked at for landscape drip. An important thing for our home vegetable gardens is the wall thickness of our drip tape. In commercial agriculture, sometimes they will lay out the drip tape and only use it for one season, laid out automatically with a tractor implement. And so they will use the thinnest product possible because they're throwing it away at the end of a season. We want to get the thickest one available for the wall thickness of the plastic so it will last us season after season. And for us, that's 15 mil. That's the thickest available. I prefer for sandy or loamy soils a 6-inch spacing as close as possible on the emitters. You can buy them at 4-inch, but that's just going to be too much for most of us for average crops. 6-inch spacing at a 0.46 gallons per hour emitter. And then usually you'll buy it in a 100-foot roll. If you're doing a decent sized vegetable garden, you can also buy it at a little bit cheaper rate at a 500-foot roll. And so that's generally what I'll do. And so depending on the irrigation supplier online, you can select all of that. Sometimes if it's something that's like a general garden website, they'll sell them, but they might not have all of that information or all the options. So Drip Depot and DripWorks are two that tend to have a wide variety of options online. And so this is basically what you're doing. Same principle. In a typical bed situation, I do 1 line for every foot of bed width. So in a typical raised bed or in-ground bed, I like to make my beds 4 feet wide with paths down either side, and then I never step in the middle of the bed again, maybe once if I'm pulling out a plant, but try to keep it uncompacted. And so to have that even spacing, you're going to go 6 inches in from each end and a foot in between. This is not a picture from one of my gardens. In Southern California, I'm going to show you a different setup. I would not want to have PVC exposed to the sun, but I realize that all my pictures of my gardens, generally, I don't have any pictures of open beds because I usually mulch them, and I'm usually putting in my irrigation later after I've established the veggies, which is just a matter of timing. It's not ideal. So here are just a rundown for your reference of what some of those options are that I just walked you through. I've also successfully used that 8-inch emitter spacing at 0.27 gallons per hour emitters. Same spacing, 1 foot apart. And so here's some sources and some of those brand names of those different kinds of drip tape if you're ordering online. Either of them work well. In sandy soils, I tend to like the higher flow rate because it will push that water out and be a little bit more even. But if you have if you're needing to get a lot of this stuff onto a small amount of valves because you have a huge garden and you don't want to put in a lot of valves, sometimes that smaller flow rate will help. Or if you have a bit of a slope or heavier, sometimes clay soil. If you have really heavy clay soil, you might need to go to an even lower flow rate, and those are available. If you are wanting to build this all from stuff you can get at the big box hardware store, you can actually at least Home Depot, possibly Lowe's as well, get this 1/4 inch drip tube, which does have a match to what I'm talking about, 6-inch dripper spacing, and it's a 0.5, so basically the same 0.46 flow rate. For some reason, it has the correct thing here, but not in the description, so don't let that confuse you. But because these tubes are so small and because the fittings are even smaller, I just find that they're more prone to clogging and not a good long-term solution. So if you have 1 or 2 raised beds, you don't want to special order stuff online, want to do all stuff you can buy locally, it's a decent option. We have some of these in our beds at work in our demonstration. They've worked fine the first couple of seasons, but I don't think they're going to be a good long-term solution. And they're not any cheaper than the stuff that you would buy online. And so just to run you through a quick installation. So starting with that 100-foot T-tape roll, we are going to need our filter. And each of these slides has the specs on the specific product and whether you can buy this at the specialty irrigation supply store locally or whether you'll have to buy it online from like one of the sources that I mentioned. Some of these, again, if you're in an area that has a specific ag supply, they might have some of this. And so unlike the landscape drip here, because the T-tape operates at a lower pressure than our landscape drip, the local irrigation supply store will not have that lower pressure. You might be able to get just the filter. So here we need to get 2 separate parts. The filter, that's the piece inside the filter. It comes with it. Just remember to take it out and flush it out every 6 months or so, maybe more. You can check it, the first couple of years and understand that frequency. And then you are going to need a pressure reducer, which gets you around 10 or 12 PSI, so much lower for the drip tape. If you are close to where your vegetable bed is going to be, 12 PSI is good. If you have a really long pipe run where you're going to be losing some more pressure, you might need to be at like a 15, or if it's really long, maybe 20 PSI, because as that water goes through the pipes, you're going to lose some pressure. So if you start very low and then run your pipe 100 feet, you might be too low at the end. If you are ordering online, which you will pretty much have to do to get these, you'll see that they have a higher flow version, medium flow version, and low flow version. So if you have a medium-sized vegetable bed, you'll probably need like the medium flow. And if you have just a few beds, you'll need this low flow version. And it has the amounts on the specifications. And then you can use some of the charts I'll show you to calculate your total flow and go from there. And so for the distribution, though, you will also be using, because you need to distribute the water before you get to your actual emitters, you will be using a solid 1/2-inch drip tube. So that looks like the landscape stuff we just looked at, but it has no emitters in it. That you can get from the local landscape supply store. The stuff that the big box hardware stores normally sell is usually a different kind of cheaper brand, and I don't like the plastics that they use in those as much. So either from the local specialty store or online. And then again, in this case, to distribute, to get from your hose bib or your valve, I like to use the drip lock stuff. And again, those same drip adapters from the last example. And so you'll see this kind of coming together in a second. And so what I do is I run the drip lock to each of the beds. And then I'll have a little inline barb valve, local landscape supply store or online, that pushes into that. And then I use this solid tube as what's called the header. So that's going to go across the edge of the bed and then connect into your drip lock pipe. So you can see here, I'm setting up each bed before I run the pipe to connect them all. And so at the base, here I had to build at one of the places I live because the only good sun was there, double tall raised beds in a driveway. But this is exactly the same for in-ground beds, typical raised beds. In-ground beds obviously won't need to rise up unless it's buried in the ground, which it might be. And so it raises up at the end. And then eventually I get a couple little brackets and I will screw these into the side of the raised bed to keep everything nice and neat. I like to be able to turn with this valve each bed off and on if I don't have anything in the bed at a certain time. And then here's the header being built out. There's a couple of different ways you can stop it at the end. I'll often use, to make it easy to flush, a second one of these little valves. You can also get a little piece that just has the pipe fold over itself and kind of lock itself shut that way. And if you're going to be doing a whole number of these beds, what I'll do is I'll set one up at the beginning, and then I will take all of my measurements. So then I'll know, like for here, I know I needed a 44-inch piece across the top, 14.5, 4, and 2. And then I can just rapidly roll out the pipe and cut a whole set for each bed. And then after I have that header in place, now we need to adapt it to the actual drip tape. And so you're going to need some sort of punch. There's many sorts of designs of punches available local stores, online. This is the one that I tend to like. Sometimes it's called the deluxe punch. Sometimes it's called a pro punch. But you need a punch for a 1/4 inch hole for a drip adapter. What I like to do is I will measure out that 6 inches, 1 foot, 1 foot, 6 inches, or whatever your spacing is going to be. And I will just use one of these little drip staples to pre-mark exactly where I want each line to be. And that way, when I'm there with my punch, I know that I'm punching in the right place. So I only need to punch once. If you punch in the wrong place, you can get a little plug called the goof plug to clog it up and seal it up. No big deal. So these are the staples. And so you put the thing over it and you squeeze it and it pops it in and it makes a perfect little hole. And then what you're going to do is you're going to have a little adapter. This left side is what goes into the tube. And you wouldn't think that these things would make a watertight seal, but they do. It's pretty magical. And then on this side, this little outside piece screws down, and then there's a barb here. But what happens is you slide the end of the drip tape over this when it's screwed out, and then you re-screw this back on, and it clamps it down. So here's putting the little piece in, and that's done. So sometimes it'll be green on the outside of the screw piece. Sometimes it'll just be black. It doesn't make a difference as long as it's the right part. When you put it in, you are going to make sure that the thing is screwed all the way back. So here they are, my 4 lines. Then you're going to take your drip tape, and where you connect it in, you're going to want to make sure that the part that screws down to connect it to the fitting, the adapter, isn't over one of these little emitters, because there's that thicker piece of plastic in there. So you might need to slice it off. You're going to measure out your length. If you have 2 people, you can just connect it and have one person roll it to the end and then cut it. So it's a little bit easier with 2 people, but either way, not that hard. Measure out your length. In this case, they were 8-foot long beds. Cut it again. Just any high quality, heavy duty scissors is going to be the best thing for this. The easiest thing to do is have your emitters facing up. It's a little bit better for the water distribution, but then you can make sure you see what you're doing. And ideally, what you want to do is as you lay your different lines, you're going to want the emitters on the next line to lay out staggered. So in between the 2 emitters on the lines next to it, that gives you the most even watering distribution. So you slide it on. And then if you need to retrim the other side because you have a little too much, you can trim it there. And then there's a couple of different styles of end caps. This is the style I was using at the time, which has a nice cap on the end that you can put the drip staple through. But to take this off to flush the line, you need to unscrew the whole thing. Since then, I've started using these ones where the drip staple just goes over here, but it just has a little screw off cap at the end. So you don't need to actually take it off the tape. You can just unscrew the cap and every season or so just flush out the lines. Once you hand tighten them down, ideally it won't drip. As I've used different brands of drip tape, that Irritex stuff I'm using now, last time I installed it, no drips at all. This was a Chapin brand available from a different supplier. The stuff worked great, but the first time I hand tightened it down, I don't know if the texture of the plastic is slightly different. It leaked a little bit. So don't worry. What you want to do is you want to get a couple of wrenches and very slightly with the water on, because you don't want to over tighten it, just barely, like something usually less than 1/4 of a turn, will tighten it up enough to make it all work. And then you will use more of these drip staples, and you're going to put them every 3 feet or so with this drip tape down the line in order to secure it in place, because this black plastic is pretty flexible. And if you don't use those staples, as the plastic heats in the middle of the day, especially if it's not covered in mulch, it'll wiggle around a little bit as it naturally expands and contracts, and you'll lose some of that efficiency in your layout. And then what you basically do, so this is what you end up with. And then what you'll do with this is that in between seasons, if you're going to be adding compost or anything like that, take your mulch off, you just unstaple it. You can flip the whole thing because it's flexible out of the bed, do what you need to do, lay it back down and restaple it down. And so this is that distribution tubing, which again could be buried in the ground or just buried in the mulch if you have a more typical garden that doesn't have concrete at the base. And then just for good measure, even though I'll flush each bed, instead of just having a cap at the end, I like to have an additional flush valve just so I can really make sure that there's no debris in the line to clog up the drippers. And so we are getting to the very end. Thank you for all of your patience, for all of you with us going over a little bit. This is just in case you download the slides, not topical to our presentation today, but just wanted to include it. This is from our raised bed and vegetable gardening class, where I included a general planting guide and plant spacing recommendations for this. If you use those 4-foot wide beds with those drip lines every 1 foot, one of the reasons why I like it is because those can also become an organizer for different sizes of crops and how many rows you have across the bed. So for these systems, I am providing you with a last chart, which will give you the precipitation rates for drip tapes with some different systems. So for the drip tape with 6-inch emitter spacing and about 0.5 gallons per hour with that 1 foot of bed, that's going to be 32 gallons per hour for that typical 6x8 bed. But most importantly, that's 1.6 inches per hour. And then if you have tears or repairs, you can just get a little fitting like this, a coupler. And so for the different conditions that I might recommend, depending on your soil and the capacity of your valve, it's going to be 6 or 8-inch emitter spacing. It's going to be 0.46 or 0.25 flow per emitter, assuming 1 foot distance between your lines. So if you have a 3-foot bed and 3 feet, it'll be consistent as well with this. Here's going to be your precipitation rates. Folds back into figuring out your run times, just like all our other examples with that same chart. And then I also did that per minute, if that's helpful in figuring out your runtime. And then again, here's the reminder, you're going to keep it below that 8.3 gallons per minute for figuring out how much you have on, how many lines you can put total on your zone, sorry, on your pipe. And so here, I also, So here's next slide is how this is going to be used also. One other thing, because we're working at such low pressure, I mentioned if you go farther away, you might have to allow for a higher level of pressure at the valve at your pressure reducer. If you're going to actually do that math, which I would encourage you to do, just to make sure everything's going to work after all your investment and design, here's the actual numbers for that loss. So most of the time we'll be working with a 3/4 inch, our supply line. It's also called header size. It's what we're talking about here. And so if you're already starting at something like 12 PSI, this is for every 100 feet of tubing, you're going to lose 5.6 PSI. That's just friction of the water running down the pipe. And so in that case, if we're starting at 12 and you do need to run 100 feet from your valve because you have a large yard, and that's just usually you won't have to, but that's how it's set up, you're going to lose another 5.6 PSI. That's going to be a little too low. So you might need to start with something closer to a 20 PSI pressure reducer and then know that that's going to be lost. That's kind of an advanced kind of calculation principle, but not that complicated. So that's really how you would do that to make sure everything's working. And then the final thing is I also provided here with the flow rate for each of these specific conditions where that's the spacing in between, that's the emitter flow rate. For every 100 feet of that T-tape that you have, so remember, like if you have 4 lines down an 8-foot bed, that's 32 linear feet per bed. So for every 100 feet, here's going to be the total flow per minute. And with that, if you're using 3/4 inch PVC or blue lock pipe, which is what most of us are going to be doing, here's the total number of linear feet to stay underneath that 8 gallons per minute velocity that we talked about earlier. This is the total capacity of the number of feet of this type of drip tape you can put on one supply line or one valve. Occasionally, for very small zones, people will just use that 1/2 inch solid brown drip line. Generally, I'd encourage you not to, because the line is so small, you lose a lot of pressure really quickly as water moves through that. But if you're really close to the valve, small front yard or something, small backyard, you can do that. And here's the maximum flow capacity for those. And so we are just about done. But just to provide an example, if you have in-ground beds that are 4 feet wide and 20 feet long, and 4 rows of drip tape, for each bed, that's 80 feet of drip tape total. So if you have that 6-inch emitter spacing and 0.46 gallons per hour emitters, based on that chart, 542 total feet of drip tape if you have that 3/4 inch supply line. So 542 divided by 80, you can have up to 6 beds of that size and layout on one supply line and one valve. If you want more than 6 beds of that size and layout, you need a second valve so that the water is not going at the same time. So just to provide it conveniently, if you're referring back to the slides later, again, we're going to go back to figure out our run times to that chart. And so with that, 1.48 inches water per hour, 7.9 inches total monthly demand, 2 times per week for your runtime in the ground maybe. So you're going to do that 7.9 divided by 80 irrigation events, because 8 total for the month, just under 1 inches per run, divided by the precipitation rate per hour, 41 minutes per run. And same thing if you're watering 3 times a week based on your soil conditions, what you're finding, 27 minutes. So that's how it all breaks down. Last note that I haven't talked about, and then we will finish with our questions and answers. Remember, last note, so all of this math, all of these charts are going to give you your best possible basic starting point, and then you're going to be most of the way there, refine it with your observations. If somehow the soil gets dry on you, you forget to water for a few days if you're doing it manually, you leave town and for some reason the water is not on, remember that your soil is like a bank account. So if your soil gets dry on you, you can't just start watering again from this chart, because you're not going to be bringing things back up to that field capacity. All of these calculations work when you're starting with that really wet through your whole root zone field capacity. So if things get dry on you, do a deep, deep watering and then start again with those numbers. So last word of advice, if you're planning this, draw out your plan, clearly note your work and your math, write down your math because you might have a question later and you can go back to it. Make a parts list before you order. Buy a few extra parts. It's good to have some extra things on hand, or if you calculated your parts wrong, you don't want to have to do another special order online. If you go into your local irrigation store for sprays or that inline landscape style drip, ask for advice. The people there are normally pretty good and happy to help, and avoid those fussy little drip parts. And here are our upcoming workshops, which might be of interest to you. So with that, thank you all so much for staying longer through the end of the talk. I apologize that it went so long. Again, first time doing this class, so it's a little bit hard to predict. And I really wanted to just not give you information, but really teach you the skills to be able to do this in the real world. So with that, what we are going to do is I am going to launch the final poll. We really need to hear from you. Now, I mentioned that this is the first time we're teaching this. Online classes are pretty new to us. So I want to really get your honest answers. If there's things that didn't work for you, we want to hear from you, because we are constantly trying to improve our teaching techniques, especially with these online classes. And if there are things that work particularly well for you, particularly valuable, especially if you've been doing this for a while, please let us know as well. So how this will work is these are all just some quick multiple choice questions like the beginning. But if you have extra feedback for us, please just type it into the chat. We are going to read every single comment and we really value them. And then also, yeah, if there's anything else you want to let us know or happen to think would be good input for us, please let us know. And so as you are doing that, I'm going to go back through and start answering any of the questions. So, question about gophers. So, I'm not going to talk about gophers with horticulture. The one thing I will say is if you have terrible gophers, you can plant your fruit trees in gopher baskets. It's not ideal. It can constrain the roots some, even though they're designed to let the roots go out. But if it's the difference between you being able to grow fruit trees or not, go for it. To order gopher baskets, traditionally people would just make them out of chicken wire. I've done that before. It takes a long time to twist them together. It's pretty frustrating. There's a company that sells online called Digger's Gopher Baskets, and you can order them in different sizes, including a tree size. They ship flat, and you just pull them open and fold the corners underneath. And that's about the best solution for large plants. If you're growing vegetables, the best solution I have for you is grow in raised beds and use hardware cloth, which is like the heavy duty square pattern chicken wire. It's a little bit smaller underneath your vegetable or your raised beds. And even if they're just a foot tall for your raised beds, that's enough for the primary root zone of the plant. And if some of the smaller roots underneath get munched, the plants will still generally survive pretty well. Make sure that that gopher wire or the hardware cloth is well stapled to your stuff. With drip line, generally because the drip line is on the surface and is not going to be buried, there are not a lot of problems with gophers with eating through the drip line. However, that's one of those things where your regular turning it on and walking your rows to make sure that there's not an issue is critical. If it's a small puncture and you have drip going, you'll hear a little hiss. If it's a large puncture, you might see a spray, or if it's a huge puncture, you'll see it all over the place. Okay, so going back up into it. So question from Irene, fruit trees are on a slope. Does she still water twice per month? What's going to determine how often you water is going to be the soil and the stage of growth of your plant. So if your trees are well established, then twice a month might be appropriately. But remember, you're going to need to do that cycle and soak if you're on a slope. So you might call it 2 irrigation events per month, or maybe once per week. And once per week will generally be fine if that helps you manage it. But you might need to have your irrigation system, or if you're doing it manually, water for a while, let it soak in for a while, water for a while, let it soak in for a while. If you have a slope and clay soil and you're doing it manually because it's a large property, you might water some over 3 consecutive days to consider it one irrigation event. It's not super ideal, but that still gets that pulsing of the water down deep into the soil if that's your best option. Question from Mary, is the Farmer's Almanac still a relevant source? Thank you so much for this oh, you're very welcome. The Farmer's Almanac, it's been a while since I read it. I had an English teacher in high school who really loved it, and I found it entertaining then, but I wasn't doing any gardening. What I will say is I will not discount old kind of traditional knowledge. I am not knowledgeable enough about using the Farmer's Almanac to totally discount it. I will say it's based on a completely different system than what we are talking about, which is the weather-based kind of weather sensor kind of system. What are my views on gray water systems for edibles? Gray water systems in terms of like safety, sanitary, you generally don't want to use them on vegetables. That can get pretty complicated, but fruit trees are generally okay. If there are worst case scenarios, some pathogens in a gray water system, because the fruit tree is bringing that water up through the fruit tree organism and out into the fruit, which is going to be harvested from above ground, human pathogens cannot get all the way through the fruit trees into the fruit in that water. Now, if your fruit tree falls off the tree and down into that gray water, that's a whole other system, a whole other situation. If you're doing gray water properly, it's never going to reach the surface anyways, so that is okay. However, I will say, the way most gray water systems work, say it's connected to your shower, is it's getting, compared to what a fruit tree wants, it's going to be a small amount of water every single day. So I know people who have been successful with gray water on like citrus trees, for example. However, in terms of getting the best quality fruit and the best long-term plant health, it's not going to be that deep soaking, dry down, deep soaking. Some subtropical trees that might be more adapted to more consistent water might be something to do. Personally, I prefer to use gray water to do something like planting a native wetland that will provide habitat. and to water my fruit trees separately because I feel like I have more control over the pacing and quantity of the water I put to the fruit trees for the best horticulture results. That being said, some people are successful. If you have a small yard, you might not get the sweetest oranges, but a lot of people do use gray water with the proper soaps, well-installed system that meets all the local regulations with edible plants. Bananas love gray water, actually. If you're in an area where it stays warm enough or you don't get enough frost to grow bananas, that's a good example. I would never plant bananas because of the water use, but they're well matched to gray water. From Carrie, about pressure regulators. She's bought a pressure regulator many times, and every time the water was leaking, so she had to return them. Makes me think the pressure regulator is designed to leak water if the pressure is high. So could be a couple of things. One, if you're buying them from a big box hardware store, they're not always the greatest quality. They might have just had a whole batch that is defective. If you're buying them from a landscape specialty supply store or from a like ag-focused special source online, that would be kind of strange. So pressure regulators are screwed in. I would make sure that your Teflon tape technique, you need to use Teflon tape to get that seal. Make sure your Teflon tape technique is right. Make sure you're tightening them enough, but not over tightening. So usually with a pressure regulator, just hand tightening will do it with 3 loops of Teflon tape over the threads, what's called in the direction of the threads. You can look that up online. I'm sure you can find a tutorial of that. And if you hand tighten it and there's a leak, you might use a wrench to do just like another quarter turn and see if you can get it to stop. If you're ordering it from a reliable source and it's time after time, it could be something like that. If your pressure is extremely high, like 150 plus PSI, which in some areas around here it will be, especially in communities with slopes at the bottom of the slope, they really need to jack up the pressure so that there's enough pressure when it gets to the top of the slope and the home's up there. It might be beyond the, if it's just the plastic type after the valve, it might be beyond the design specifications for what the pressure regulator is engineered for. In that case, before you have all your valves, you would need to install like one of those Wilkins style, like you would use for a whole house pressure regulator, and step it down. So that can take an extremely high pressure, get that down to something reasonable like 50 PSI, and then you can have your pressure regulator after the valve to get down to your drip pressure. And if you have more questions about that, type in again, and I'm happy to talking about the pressure regulator before the drip. Okay, I was going to say that. So what you might need to do, and again, I did this at my place. I did this when I was redoing my parents' front lawn to a water-wise garden. Is before all of your valves, a Wilkins is the name of the main company. It's kind of the standard one used in construction. Wilkins. Like a Wilkins brass 3/4 inch pressure regulator. If you like look online at like Home Depot or Lowe's websites, you can find out about it and find tutorials online about how to put them in. But I would try something like that right before all of your valves, where the main line is going to your valves. Okay, from Jim. My neighbor who is a plumber suggested 1-inch irrigation. I have a 1/3 acre. Is that a good suggestion? My meter is 5/8 of an inch. It can, in certain cases, help. And so here's the deal. Your meter is 5/8 of an inch. Your supply line, like in the street to the meter, is much larger than that. And a 5/8 inch meter can actually supply much more water through it safely than a 3/4 inch like pipe coming off of that would need. And so in some cases, you can go up to 1 inch, but it's all going to be based on what pipe is coming directly out of your meter. So if you have a 5/8 meter and you immediately after that have 3/4 inch pipe that go like into your house and, for example, maybe like around to your backyard, and then that's where your valves are going to be, don't go back up to a larger size, because if you use the capacity of that size, that's going to be running water way too fast through that length of 3/4 inch pipe. Something that sometimes does happen, this is how my house was set up, is after the initial plumbing, when the plumbing was redone, wasn't redone that well through the front yard. It was only buried 6 inches deep, but out of the 5/8 inch meter, it's a 1 inch main water line that runs to the point where the landscape irrigation separates from the house. Then after that point, it goes down to 3/4 of an inch going through the whole house pressure regulator into the house. And then the 1 inch just kind of stubs off. Now, what I did at that point in time is I put that back down to 3/4 of an inch. And so I know I have the full capacity of 3/4 of an inch for my landscape side and a good more capacity at 3/4 of an inch on the house side because I have that 1 inch flow coming from the street. Now, theoretically, if I wanted to, I have a third of an acre lot as well, just over a third of an acre. Theoretically, if I wanted to, I could have kept that at 1 inch for the irrigation system as well, and kind of maximize that. I would have also, if you're running your pipe a long way, have a little bit less of that pressure drop because the wider the pipe is, the less of the pressure drop you have due to that friction in the pipe. So there are some advantages, but then your costs also start getting higher with 1 inch pipe and if you go to 1 inch valves. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but it's just specific to what you're trying to achieve. And on my 3rd acre lot, with how I have things sectioned up, I was perfectly happy. I appreciate having that 1 inch line coming from the street, but I was perfectly happy to go back down to 3/4 inch irrigation. I feel like probably through how I would have my landscape anyways, I only needed to install 1 extra valve and my costs were quite a bit cheaper. So hope that's helpful, Jim. So from Felicia, it's a good question. How do you wean new plants off of daily watering? That is a good question. I would say, just general rule, I'm probably normally doing daily watering, say maybe about a week after transplanting. And then for seeds, I don't know. It's just kind of when they're starting not to look like a total seedling and starting to look like a little real plant, I would say. But it's also going to depend on the time of year. So for my fall crop, I'm going to be able to wean plants off of daily watering faster than my spring crop because it's warmer. In probably another 3 years in my garden of building soil and organic matter and composting, I might be able to also do that because I'll have better water holding capacity in my soil a little bit faster than I do now. And so what I say is it's kind of just going to be a judgment until you get experience with your specific garden. But then again, remember, if you have like a heat wave for a week, you might have to be back on it. And then I just really pay attention to my plants. The first few days after I'm trying to go off daily watering, I really keep a close eye on my plants. I might check them at the beginning of the day. And then if I'm going to be off, not at home at work, at the end of the day, and feel free. And then I'll go back, to it if I need to. And it's just really kind of paying attention and going from there. From Wendy, she has a ½ acre and her fruit tree roots, gophers ate her fruit tree roots and killed them. So she has a container garden. That is one way to do it, but I would encourage you, if you want to try it again, to try that raised bed with the hardware cloth. That could be pretty effective. How do I know how much water to use in a raised bed when watering with a hose or a sprinklering watering can? Good question, Debbie. Okay, so what I am going to do briefly is I am going to bring up a older version of a I'm going to bring up an older version of this presentation where I had less content about irrigation system specifics, and I did have a slide with I should have kept it at the end of this one. I apologize. I did have a slide with specific information about the hose. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, here we go. So this is how to use these charts where it's going to give you your monthly water demand, how to use these charts with a hose. Sometimes that's just what we have to deal with. And again, most of the time, what I find is people with a hose, they're going to be watering maybe a little too often, but not deeply enough to really get down that water. So how many times a month you'll be watering, that's no different with the hose. The plants are going to need the same amount of water either way. And so once you get your inches of water to water each time, just like all those other methods, what you're going to need to do is you are going to need to convert the inches of water you're going to try to put down. So say you're going to try to put down 1 inch of water to keep the math simple. You are going to need to convert that to gallons, because that's going to be the way to get numbers for your hose watering or your water can watering. So you are going to convert inches to gallons by coming up with the number of gallons per square foot of vegetable bed area you're going to be watering. So the way to do that is to multiply the number of inches by 0.62. That will give you gallons per square foot. So if you're going to put down 1 inch, then you're going to need to put down 0.62 gallons of water per square foot of area that you're watering to achieve that. And so, for example, say you're going to be hose watering a standard 4 by 8 foot raised bed. So 4 by 8 is 32 square feet. So to put down that 1 inch of water, you're going to do 32 square feet times 0.62, because that's the conversion. And so to put down 1 inch of water over that 32 square feet, I just typed into my calculator, you're going to need 19.8. So basically 20 gallons of water. So this math will work out easy for an example. So 0.62 gallons per square foot per inch. So 20 gallons of water to put down 1 inch of water in that raised bed. So then what's not on this chart is then you need to figure out for your hose or your setup or your watering can, how do you put down a gallon of water? So for my hose watering, for example, I have a specific watering wand with a specific water breaker that I put down. And then also you're going to need to kind of approximate like how wide open do you have the hose each time you are watering? And that's going to need to be consistent to use this to figure it out. So basically you get your hose and your water flow set up exactly like you're going to water. And then you fill up a 5-gallon bucket and you figure out how long it takes to do that using a stopwatch. So say with your exact setup, just to keep the numbers simple, it takes exactly 1 minute to fill up a 5-gallon bucket. And so then you're going to know that it takes 1 minute to get 5 gallons out of that hose. And so then you do the math to get 20 gallons of water, which you're going to need for your raised bed, you're going to need to multiply that by 4, because 5 times 4 is 20 gallons. So you're going to need to water 4 minutes of consistent water for each raised bed to get down that 1 inch of water, if that's how your numbers work out. And so if that's the case, then you're also going to need to figure out is, can that one raised bed handle absorbing that much water all at once? If the answer is no, then what you might have to do is water for 1 minute or water for 2 minutes, then go do something else, maybe water another area, then come back and water again so the soil can fully absorb it. So hopefully that makes sense. So if you have 4 raised beds, you literally have a timer going. If that's going to be how you really want to do this accurately, if that's your situation, water a fourth of the time, then water the next bed, the next bed, the next bed. And by the time you get back down to the first one, you can water it again if you need to kind of rotate through or do something like that. So hopefully, and then if you have a watering can, then you just need to measure out, if you have a 2-gallon capacity watering can and you need to put down 20 gallons, you're going to have to fill that up to the 2-gallon mark 10 times and get all that water out there. So hopefully, Debbie, that made sense. If you still have questions about it, type them back in and we'll get back around to you. So, okay, that was somebody typing where they learned about this. Thank you very much. Okay, so from Wendy, put 10 trees on drip emitters with the microtubing and lost all of that. On our recommendation, will I now put the valve back in use and use emitter tubing, as you said, and redo the system? Yeah, absolutely. If you have a valve and the right pressure regulator, so check if you're going to be doing that landscape emitter tubing. Make sure the pressure regulator that you put in for your microtubing, first make sure you have your filter. And then if your pressure regulator is that 30 or 40 PSI pressure regulator, yeah, you can just go back to that valve, back to that pressure regulator. Or if you actually brought 3/4 inch line all the way to where that microtubing started near your fruit trees, you can just go back to that 3/4 inch line. But yeah, at a certain point, you can just cut it off, reuse the best of what's there. You shouldn't need to really change the valve if that was installed well. And then you can use the proper adapters and do this kind of system that we have here. You don't need to start your work all over again. Question from Joanne. What are your thoughts about using straw bale as installation and to retain water for container gardens? So I'm assuming you mean that as a mulch layer, Joanne. If that is the case, use what you have access to. So a lot of areas, some of them because of the pandemic are not doing it right now. So for example, right now, my agency's free mulch program is on hold right now. We are working to get it reopened as soon as we can, but we give away a really nice wood chip mulch for free. That's what I use on my containers. It's reliable, it's good quality, and it's free. For me, for straw, and it'll work just as well, if not maybe better than straw. For straw, if you live in a rural area or you have, someone who sometimes has like some extra spoiled old straw that they're not going to use and it's available for you easily, then that's great. If you need to buy it and drive it home with a truck and you can get a hold of wood chip mulch easier, I would do that. The only caveat I would have with straw is understand where it's coming from, because in straw and hay production these days, sometimes there's been some cases where there's some pretty gnarly herbicides that don't affect the grasses, but might affect other plants that in agricultural areas that are growing a lot of hay might use. And some of those could actually, if those chemicals accumulate in your vegetable beds, stunt your plants. And I've read some cases of that. So know where your straw is coming from. But if you know it's a clean product without herbicides, then and you have access to it, then go for it. It's just fine as mulch. So question from Debbie. Does the water have to be on full blast when using drip line for a raised vegetable bed? Can it be disconnected for faucet to be used for some other reason than reconnected to the vegetable bed? So I will absolutely normally put it on full blast just to make sure it has the maximum flow. And then again, remember, if you're connecting it to the faucet so what I would do is usually I will have my pressure reducer and filter with a little cap on it, like I showed for the fruit tree irrigation system. You can do it the exact same way for the drip system. So I might have that out in the garden with the cap over it. And then I'll bring the hose over, take the cap off and connect it. And yeah, I'll have it on full blast. You want to give the maximum flow it might possibly need. And then the pressure reducer will take care of, if it's open quite a bit, and then you can turn it off. And then you can use it just like any other hose bib, any other time. Now, the other option you would have is you can get at most hardware stores, irrigation supply stores, you can get a splitter on a hose bib where it's a little thing. I would always get the brass one instead of the plastic one where it goes in different directions and there's a little valve for each side. And you can permanently have one of those valves connected to the drip system and one of them used for whatever else, and build the whole thing all the way out to the hose and then just manage which valve is open or closed. Just remember to make sure when I've done that at times in the past, sometimes I'll turn accidentally the hose bib off instead of the hose bib and the valve going to the irrigation off. And then the next time you run the hose bib, you're accidentally watering your drip zone also. But absolutely, yeah, you can do either of those and it'll work just fine. So from Wendy. So if this is for the irrigation class, just to let you know. Okay, I have 4 valves in the front yard right off the house and no water in the back except a hose bib on the house wall. I have drip into the back 5 plants running from the front. Do I need to have a valve in line added in the back, or do I run one from the front yard area? It depends on where else your main line goes. If it's if it's going to be a decent amount of trenching either way. That's very similar to the situation I had at my house. And at that point, it's almost a toss up. If you don't know where your irrigation runs, you're going to have to trench around to the backyard anyways. And so you can add a valve to the front and trench and then just run the piping that's going to water your plants around to the back. The advantage of that is that I guess there's less new main line that's always going to be under pressure, that if something breaks is going to cause an issue running all the way through your yard. When I had that situation, I knew that I was going to add 5 valves into the backyard. So in that same trench, instead of running just the after the valve, I ran more main line all the way around to the backyard. And I added some new hose bibs, not off the house, in the backyard because I had main line. And then I added my 5 valves. So it depends. It's up to you. If you are going to be doing this work yourself and you haven't done a lot of irrigation work, it would be a little bit safer not to run all that new main line maybe. But if you're confident, or if you're going to be working with someone who is confident, or hiring a landscaper, with the caveat that if there's more main line that could potentially break or leak in the future, if you're confident that that's not going to be an issue, or just understand that, I would prefer to put more main line in the back because it's more flexible to expand in the future and put in a few new hose bibs farther down in the yard maybe than if I just ran the valve or put the valve in the front and ran the line all the way around. So for Barbara, I teach gardening for low to no vision gardeners. That is really awesome. There's so much cool stuff you can do with sensory gardening. That's really cool to hear. Do you know of a water meter that is audible? Unfortunately, no, I don't. So maybe, it depends on what your goals are, because normally I encourage people to dig deep and feel. On vegetables, sometimes you can just stick your fingers, if you can get your finger most of the way down, 3 inches down, and just feel, you can gauge whether or not, based on how dry it is, you can kind of learn to gauge whether or not it's time to water. So that would be the best thing that I know of. I do not know of any water meters that are audible. From Bonnie. I'd like to know, is moving a big citrus tree from one place to another how to make it survive? I do not recommend it. It is very difficult. Especially, it's not even like planting a big container box tree. There's so much trauma to the plant that in most cases, you're better off just planting a new tree. Survival rates are generally pretty low if you are trying to do it. And then the root zone in the soil is so heavy. That is something that if you are even going to try, it's best left to professionals. But when we used to do commercial scale projects, I've worked on some large scale tree moving with professionals. It takes a long time to do the best you can. It's expensive and the trees still get stressed. So in most cases, you're better just replanting. Okay, so from Wendy, I don't have a valve that you're using in the front yard to install line. I think I covered that as well. Yeah, okay, it looks like I did. Okay, so let's see. I think we have gotten through all of the questions. I will jump over and see if there's any questions that came through in the chat. So from Lisa, what's your opinion on inorganic salt fertilizers instructing to repeat feeding and watering every 2 to 3 weeks or as instructed? I don't like to use inorganic salt fertilizers for a variety of reasons. I always encourage organic fertilizers for multiple reasons. The number one being that it's really hard to over irrigate and over fertilize with organic fertilizers because it's processed through the whole soil food web before it's plant available. And that's a slow and sustained process. You're never going to damage your plants. Where with the inorganic high potency fertilizers, which have salt in them, if you water too much, you can stress and damage your plants pretty easily. And then over time, yeah, they do tend to build up salts in the soil. Over time, they tend to be negative for the life in the soil. And so much of building better soil every single year, which should be the goal. Every year, if you're using organic systems, even if you're not someone who buys all organic food, as a home gardener, if you use organic processes, you can be in a situation where, with a little bit of crop rotation as well, in terms of the structure of your soil, every year you are getting better and better soil. And where people tend to use those inorganic fertilizers as instructed, what happens is after a number of years, the soils tend to kind of be less and less good. If you are doing things perfectly, to some degree, the plants themselves don't actually care, because by the time it's plant available, nutrients are nutrients. But it's just so much easier to manage plant nutrients as well as soil structure and beneficial soil life with using organics. So that's my general approach. And for me, I'll use compost when I have it a couple of times a year at the beginning of the season. And then I'll normally do right when I plant, and then one time mid-season with an organic fertilizer in my veggies. And then also about twice a season, maybe a little bit more often, every couple of months for young citrus, because they're high nutrient demanding, with organics for my fruit trees. Okay, thank you for the suggestion, Christine. If you are still with us, that makes a lot of sense. And what I would encourage you is, yeah, for some of the stuff for beginning gardeners that might be more technical, I will say, just from being exposed to all of this, even if it's a while till you're maybe going to be using everything, just starting to think about what to think about and what you might want to learn over time should be able to help. I would also encourage you to use this kind of more technical workshop. Is something that builds in a lot of like local kind of specifics. And this is sort of stuff that I've never seen presented on the internet anywhere else in this way. But there is a lot of great content on YouTube about basic vegetable garden, basic irrigation. And one really good source of high quality information is there is an online kind of organic farming supplier that caters to both home gardeners as well as small organic farms in California. They are called Peaceful Valley Farm Supply. Their website is groworganic.com. And they have a lot of great tutorial videos on different topics for beginning gardeners, specifically for edible gardens. Okay, I think that has got us through all of the questions. So thank you very much for those of you who have sat through this whole thing. Makes me feel like I am providing some good information. So yeah, I hope it was useful. If you have any last questions, I will hang out here as people kind of filter out. But if not, then we will get, I'll get by the end of the day today, I will have the slides of this posted online. And then by probably midweek next week, we'll have the YouTube recording of all of this, including questions and answers, up at cbwcd.org/YouTube. And have a good rest of the weekend, everybody, and happy and productive gardening and irrigating.